in which Eeyore has a birthday and gets 2 presents, from Winnie the Pooh, by A. Milne. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Eeyore, the old grey donkey, stood by the side of the stream and looked at himself in the water. "Pathetic," he said. "That's what it is. Pathetic." He turned and walked slowly down the stream for 20 yards, splashed across it, and walked slowly back on the other side. Then he looked at himself in the water again. "As I thought," he said. "No better from this side. But nobody minds. Nobody cares. Pathetic. That's what it is." There was a crackling noise in the bracken behind him, and out came Pooh. "Good morning, Eeyore," said Pooh. "Good morning, Pooh Bear," said Eeyore gloomily. "If it is a good morning," he said. "Which I doubt," said he. "Why, what's the matter?" "Nothing, Pooh Bear, nothing. We can't all, and some of us don't. That's all there is to it." "Can't all what?" said Pooh, rubbing his nose. "Gaiety, song and dance. Here we go round the mulberry bush." "Oh," said Pooh. He thought for a long time and then asked, "What mulberry bush is that?" "Bonhomie," went on Eeyore gloomily. "French word meaning bonhomie," he explained. "I'm not complaining, but there it is." Pooh sat down on a large stone and tried to think this out. It sounded to him like a riddle, and he was never much good at riddles, being a bear of very little brain. So he sang Coddleston Pie instead. "Coddleston, Coddleston, Coddleston Pie, a fly can't bird, but a bird can fly. Ask me a riddle and I reply, Coddleston, Coddleston, Coddleston Pie." That was the first verse. When he had finished it, Eeyore didn't actually say that he didn't like it, so Pooh very kindly sang the second verse to him. "Coddleston, Coddleston, Coddleston Pie, a fish can't whistle and neither can I. Ask me a riddle and I reply, Coddleston, Coddleston, Coddleston Pie." Eeyore still said nothing at all, so Pooh hummed the third verse quietly to himself. "Coddleston, Coddleston, Coddleston Pie, why does a chicken? I don't know why. Ask me a riddle and I reply, Coddleston, Coddleston, Coddleston Pie." "That's right," said Eeyore. "Sing. Umpty tiddly, umpty too. Here we go gathering nuts and may. Enjoy yourself." "I am," said Pooh. "Some can," said Eeyore. "Why, what's the matter?" "Is anything the matter?" "You seem so sad, Eeyore." "Sad? Why should I be sad? It's my birthday, the happiest day of the year." "Your birthday?" said Pooh in great surprise. "Of course it is. Can't you see? Look at all the presents I have had." He waved a foot from side to side. "Look at the birthday cake. Candles and pink sugar." Pooh looked, first to the right and then to the left. "Presents?" said Pooh. "Birthday cake?" said Pooh. "Where?" "Can't you see them?" "No," said Pooh. "Neither can I," said Eeyore. "Joke," he explained. "Ha, ha." Pooh scratched his head, being a little puzzled by all this. "But is it really your birthday?" he asked. "It is." "Oh, well, many happy returns of the day, Eeyore." "And many happy returns to you, Pooh Bear." "But it isn't my birthday." "No, it's mine." "But you said many happy returns." "Well, why not? You don't always want to be miserable on my birthday, do you?" "Oh, I see," said Pooh. "It's bad enough," said Eeyore, almost breaking down, "being miserable myself, what with no presents and no cake and no candles and no proper notice taken of me at all. But if everybody else is going to be miserable too—" This was too much for Pooh. "Stay there," he called to Eeyore, as he turned and hurried back home as quick as he could, for he felt that he must get poor Eeyore a present of some sort at once, and he could always think of a proper one afterwards. Outside his house he found Piglet, jumping up and down, trying to reach the knocker. "Hello, Piglet," he said. "Hello, Pooh," said Piglet. "What are you trying to do?" "I was trying to reach the knocker," said Piglet. "I just came round." "Let me do it for you," said Pooh kindly. So he reached up and knocked at the door. "I have just seen Eeyore," he began, "and poor Eeyore is in a very sad condition, because it's his birthday, and nobody has taken any notice of it, and he's very gloomy. You know what Eeyore is. And there he was, and— What a long time whoever lives here is answering this door." And he knocked again. "But Pooh," said Piglet, "it's your own house." "Oh," said Pooh, "so it is," he said. "Well, let's go in." So in they went. The first thing Pooh did was to go to the cupboard to see if he had quite a small jar of honey left, and he had, so he took it down. "I'm giving this to Eeyore," he explained, "as a present. What are you going to give?" "Couldn't I give it too?" said Piglet. "From both of us?" "No," said Pooh. "That would not be a good plan." "All right, then. I'll give him a balloon. I've got one left for my party. I'll go and get it now, shall I?" "That, Piglet, is a very good idea. It is just what Eeyore wants to cheer him up. Nobody can be uncheered with a balloon." So off Piglet trotted, and in the other direction went Pooh, with his jar of honey. It was a warm day, and he had a long way to go. He hadn't gone more than halfway when a sort of funny feeling began to creep all over him. It began at the tip of his nose, and trickled all through him, and out at the soles of his feet. It was just as if somebody inside him were saying, "Now then, Pooh, time for a little something." "Dear, dear," said Pooh. "I didn't know it was as late as that." So he sat down and took the top off his jar of honey. "Lucky I brought this with me," he thought. "Many a bear going out on a warm day like this would never have thought of bringing a little something with him." And he began to eat. "Now, let me see," he thought as he took his last lick of the inside of the jar. "Where was I going? Ah, yes, Eeyore." He got up slowly. And then, suddenly, he remembered. He had eaten Eeyore's birthday present. "Bother," said Pooh. "What shall I do? I must give him something." For a little while he couldn't think of anything. Then he thought, "Well, it's a very nice pot, even if there's no honey in it, and if I washed it clean and got somebody to write a happy birthday on it, Eeyore could keep things in it, which might be useful." So as he was just passing the 100-acre wood, he went inside to call on Owl, who lived there. "Good morning, Owl," he said. "Good morning, Pooh," said Owl. "Many happy returns of Eeyore's birthday," said Pooh. "Oh, is that what it is?" "What are you giving him, Owl?" "What are you giving him, Pooh?" "I'm giving him a useful pot to keep things in, and I wanted to ask you, Is this it? Said Owl, taking it out of Pooh's paw. Yes, and I wanted to ask you. Somebody has been keeping honey in it, said Owl. You can keep anything in it, said Pooh earnestly. It's very useful like that. And I wanted to ask you. You ought to write a happy birthday on it. That was what I wanted to ask you, said Pooh, because my spelling is wobbly. It's good spelling, but it wobbles, and the letters get in the wrong places. Would you write a happy birthday on it for me? It's a nice pot, said Owl, looking at it all round. Couldn't I give it too, from both of us? No, said Pooh, that would not be a good plan. Now I'll just wash it first, and then you can write on it. Well, he washed the pot out and dried it, while Owl licked the end of his pencil and wondered how to spell birthday. Can you read, Pooh? He asked a little anxiously. There's a notice about knocking and ringing outside my door, which Christopher Robin wrote. Could you read it? Christopher Robin told me what it said, and then I could. Well, I'll tell you what this says, and then you'll be able to. So Owl wrote, and this is what he wrote. Hippy-pappy bthootha bthoothy. Pooh looked on admiringly. I'm just saying a happy birthday, said Owl carelessly. It's a nice long one, said Pooh, very much impressed by it. Well, actually, of course, I'm saying a very happy birthday with love from Pooh. Naturally, it takes a good deal of pencil to say a long thing like that. Oh, I see, said Pooh. While all this was happening, Piglet had gone back to his own house to get Eeyore's balloon. He held it very tightly against himself so that it shouldn't blow away, and he ran as fast as he could so as to get to Eeyore before Pooh did, for he thought that he would like to be the first one to give a present, just as if he had thought of it without being told by anybody. And running along and thinking how pleased Eeyore would be, he didn't look where he was going, and suddenly he put his foot in a rabbit hole and fell down flat on his face. Bang! Piglet lay there wondering what had happened. At first he thought that the whole world had blown up, and then he thought that perhaps only the forest part of it had, and then he thought that perhaps only he had, and he was now alone in the moon or somewhere, and would never see Christopher Robin or Pooh or Eeyore again. And then he thought, well, even if I'm in the moon, I needn't be face downwards all the time. So he got cautiously up and looked about him. He was still in the forest. Well, that's funny, he thought. I wonder what that bang was. I couldn't have made such a noise just falling down. And where's my balloon? And what's that small piece of damp rag doing? It was the balloon. Oh, dear, said Piglet. Oh, dearie, dearie, dear. Well, it's too late now. I can't go back, and I haven't another balloon, and perhaps Eeyore doesn't like balloons so very much. So he trotted on, rather sadly now, and down he came to the side of the stream where Eeyore was, and called out to him. Good morning, Eeyore, shouted Piglet. Good morning, little Piglet, said Eeyore. If it is a good morning, he said. Which I doubt, said he. Not that it matters, he said. Many happy returns of the day, said Piglet, having now got closer. Eeyore stopped looking at himself in the stream and turned to stare at Piglet. Just say that again, he said. Wait a moment. Balancing on 3 legs, he began to bring his 4th leg very cautiously up to his ear. I did this yesterday, he explained as he fell down for the 3rd time. It's quite easy. It's so as I can hear better. There, that's done it. Now then, what were you saying? He pushed his ear forward with his hoof. Many happy returns of the day, said Piglet again. Meaning me? Of course, Eeyore. My birthday? Yes, Me having a real birthday?
Yes, Eeyore, and I've brought you a present.
Eeyore took down his right hoof from his right ear, turned round, and with great difficulty put up his left hoof. I must have that in the other ear, he said. Now then.
A present,
said Piglet very loudly. Meaning me again?
Yes.
My birthday still?
Of course, Eeyore.
Me going on, having a real birthday?
Yes, Eeyore, and I brought you a balloon.
Balloon? Said Eeyore. You did say balloon. One of those big colored things you blow up? Gaiety, song and dance. Here we are and there we are?
Yes, but I'm afraid. I'm very sorry, Eeyore, but when I was running along to bring it you, I fell down.
Dear, dear, how unlucky. You ran too fast, I expect. You didn't hurt yourself, little piglet.
No, but oh, Eeyore, I burst the balloon.
There was a very long silence. My balloon? Said Eeyore at last. Piglet nodded. My birthday balloon?
Yes, Eeyore, said Piglet, sniffing a little. Here it is, with many happy returns of the day.
And he gave Eeyore the small piece of damp rag. Is this it? Said Eeyore, a little surprised. Piglet nodded. My present? Piglet nodded again. The balloon?
Yes.
Thank you, Piglet, said Eeyore. You don't mind my asking, he went on, but what color was this balloon when it was a balloon?
Red.
I just wondered. Red, he murmured to himself. My favorite color. How big was it?
About as big as me.
I just wondered. About as big as Piglet, he said to himself sadly. My favorite size. Well, well. Piglet felt very miserable and didn't know what to say. He was still opening his mouth to begin something, and then deciding that it wasn't any good saying that, when he heard a shout from the other side of the river, and there was Pooh. Many happy returns of the day, called out Pooh, forgetting that he had said it already. Thank you, Pooh. I'm having them, said Eeyore gloomily. I've brought you a little present, said Pooh excitedly. I've had it, said Eeyore. Pooh had now splashed across the stream to Eeyore, and Piglet was sitting a little way off, his head in his paws, snuffling to himself. It's a useful pot, said Pooh. Here it is, and it's got a very happy birthday with love from Pooh written on it. That's what all that writing is, and it's for putting things in. There. When Eeyore saw the pot, he became quite excited. Why, he said, I believe my balloon will just go into that pot. Oh, no, Eeyore, said Pooh. Balloons are much too big to go into pots. What you do with a balloon is you hold the balloon. Not mine, said Eeyore proudly. Look, Piglet. And as Piglet looked sorrowfully round, Eeyore picked the balloon up with his teeth and placed it carefully in the pot, picked it out and put it on the ground, and then picked it up again and put it carefully back. So it does, said Pooh. It goes in.
So it does, said Piglet. And it comes out.
Doesn't it, said Eeyore. It goes in and out like anything. I'm very glad, said Pooh happily, that I thought of giving you a useful pot to put things in.
I'm very glad, said Piglet happily, that I thought of giving you something to put in a useful pot.
But Eeyore wasn't listening. He was taking the balloon out and putting it back again, as happy as could be.
And didn't I give him anything?
asked Christopher Robin sadly. Of course you did, I said. You gave him, don't you remember, a little...
I gave him a box of paints to paint things with.
That was it.
Why didn't I give it to him in the morning?
You were so busy getting his party ready for him. He had a cake with icing on the top and 3 candles, and his name in pink sugar and...
Yes, I remember,
said Christopher Robin. End of In Which Eeyore Has a Birthday and Gets 2 Presents, from Winnie the Pooh, by A. Milne. Read by Winnifred Assmann.
The Tale of Ginger and Pickles by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Once upon a time there was a village shop. The name over the window was Ginger and Pickles. It was a little small shop, just the right size for dolls. Lucinda and Jane Doll. Cook always bought their groceries at Ginger and Pickles. The counter inside was a convenient height for rabbits. Ginger and Pickles sold red, spotty pocket handkerchiefs at a penny 3 farthings. They also sold sugar and snuff and galoshes. In fact, although it was such a small shop, it sold nearly everything, except a few things that you want in a hurry, like bootlaces, hairpins, and mutton chops. Ginger and Pickles were the people who kept the shop. Ginger was a yellow tomcat, and Pickles was a terrier. The rabbits were always a little bit afraid of Pickles. The shop was also patronized by mice. Only the mice were rather afraid of Ginger. Ginger usually requested Pickles to serve them, because he said it made his mouth water. "I cannot bear," said he, "to see them going out the door, carrying their little parcels." "I have the same feeling about rats," replied Pickles. "But it would never do to eat our own customers. They would leave us and go to Tabitha Twitchit's." "On the contrary, they would go nowhere," replied Ginger gloomily. Tabitha Twitchit kept the only other shop in the village. She did not give credit. Ginger and Pickles gave unlimited credit. Now, the meaning of credit is this. When a customer buys a bar of soap, instead of the customer pulling out a purse and paying for it, she says she will pay another time. And Pickles makes a low bow and says, "With pleasure, madam," and it is written down in a book. The customers come again and again and buy quantities in spite of being afraid of Ginger and Pickles. But there is no money in what is called the till. The customers came in crowds every day and bought quantities, especially the toffee customers. But there was always no money. They never paid for as much as a pennyworth of peppermints. But the sales were enormous, 10 times as large as Tabitha Twitchit's. As there was always no money, Ginger and Pickles were obliged to eat their own goods. Pickles ate biscuits, and Ginger ate a dried haddock. They ate them by candlelight after the shop was closed. When it came to January 1st, there was still no money, and Pickles was unable to buy a dog license. "It is very unpleasant. I am afraid of the police," said Pickles. "It is your own fault for being a terrier. I do not require a license, and neither does Kep, the collie dog. It is very uncomfortable. I am afraid I shall be summoned. I have tried in vain to get a license upon credit at the post office," said Pickles. "The place is full of policemen. I met one as I was coming home. Let us send the bill again to Samuel Whiskers, Ginger. He owes 22 shillings and 9 pence for bacon." "I do not believe that he intends to pay it all," replied Ginger. "And I feel sure that Anna Maria pockets things. Where are all the cream crackers?" "You have eaten them yourself," replied Ginger. Ginger and Pickles retired into the back parlor. They did accounts. They added up sums and sums and sums. "Samuel Whiskers has run up a bill as long as his tail. He has had 1 ounce and 3/4 of snuff since October. What is 7 pounds of butter at 1 threepence, and a stick of sealing wax, and 4 matches? Send in all the bills again to everybody, with compts," replied Ginger. After a time, they heard a noise in the shop, as if something had been pushed in at the door. They came out of the back parlor. There was an envelope lying on the counter, and a policeman writing in a notebook. Pickles nearly had a fit. He barked and made little rushes. "Bite him, Pickles, bite him!" spluttered Ginger behind a sugar barrel. "He's only a German doll." The policeman went on writing in his notebook. Twice he put his pencil in his mouth, and once dipped it in the treacle. Pickles barked till he was hoarse, but still the policeman took no notice. He had bead eyes, and his helmet was sewed on with stitches. At length, on his last little rush, Pickles found that the shop was empty. The policeman had disappeared, but the envelope remained. "Do you think that he has gone to fetch a real live policeman? I'm afraid it is a summons," said Pickles. "No," replied Ginger, who had opened the envelope. "It is the rates and taxes. 3 pounds, 19 shillings, 11 pence, and 3 farthings. "This is the last straw," said Pickles. "Let us close the shop." They put up the shutters and left, but they have not removed from the neighborhood. In fact, some people wish they had gone further. Ginger is living in the warren. I do not know what occupation he pursues. He looks stout and comfortable. Pickles is at present a gamekeeper. The closing of the shop caused great inconvenience. Tabitha Twitchit immediately raised the price of everything a halfpenny, and she continued to refuse to give credit. Of course, there are the tradesmen's carts, the butcher, the fishman, and Timothy Baker, but a person cannot live on seed wigs and sponge cake and butter buns, not even when the sponge cake is as good as Timothy's. After a time, Mr. John Dormouse and his daughter began to sell peppermints and candles, but they did not keep self-fitting sixes, and it takes 5 mice to carry one 7-inch candle. Besides, the candles which they sell behave very strangely in warm weather, and Miss Dormouse refused to take back the ends when they were brought back to her with complaints. And when Mr. John Dormouse was complained to, he stayed in bed and would say nothing but "very snug," which is not the way to carry on a retail business. So everybody was pleased when Sally Henny-Penny sent out a printed poster to say she was going to reopen the shop. Henny's opening sale, grand cooperative jumble, Penny's penny prices. Come buy, come try, come buy. The poster really was most 'ticing. There was a rush upon the opening day. The shop was crammed with customers, and there were crowds of mice upon the biscuit canisters. Sally Henny-Penny gets rather flustered when she tries to count out change, and she insists on being paid cash. But She is quite harmless, and she has laid in a remarkable assortment of bargains. There is something to please everybody. End of The Tale of Ginger and Pickles by Beatrix Potter.
The Wonderful History of Henny-Penny by Anonymous. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. One fine summer morning, a hen was picking peas in a farmyard under a pea stack when a pea fell on her head with such a thump that she thought a cloud had fallen, and she thought she would go to the court and tell the king that the clouds are falling. So she gayed, and she gayed, and she gayed, and she met a cock. And the cock said, "Where are you going today, Henny-Penny?" And she said, "Oh, Cocky Locky, the clouds are falling, and I am going to tell the king." And Cocky Locky said, "I will go with you, Henny-Penny." So Cocky Locky and Henny-Penny, they gayed and they gayed and they gayed, till they met a duck. So the duck said, "Where are you going today, Cocky Locky and Henny-Penny?" And they said, "Oh, Ducky Daddles, the clouds are falling, and we are going to tell the king." And Ducky Daddles said, "I will go with you, Cocky Locky and Henny-Penny." So Ducky Daddles and Cocky Locky and Henny-Penny, they gayed and they gayed and they gayed, till they met a goose. So the goose said, "Where are you going today, Ducky Daddles, Cocky Locky, and Henny-Penny?" And they said, "Oh, Goosey Poosey, the clouds are falling, and we are going to tell the king." And Goosey Poosey said, "I will go with you, Ducky Daddles, Cocky Locky, and Henny-Penny." So Goosey Poosey and Ducky Daddles and Cocky Locky and Henny-Penny, they gayed and they gayed and they gayed, till they met a turkey. So the turkey said, "Where are you going today, Goosey Poosey, Ducky Daddles, Cocky Locky, and Henny-Penny?" And they said, "Oh, Turkey Lurkey, the clouds are falling, and we are going to tell the king." And Turkey Lurkey said, "I will go with you, Goosey Poosey, Ducky Daddles, Cocky Locky, and Henny-Penny." So Turkey Lurkey and Goosey Poosey and Ducky Daddles and Cocky Locky and Henny-Penny, they gayed and they gayed and they gayed, till they met a fox. So the fox said, "Where are you going today, Turkey Lurkey, Goosey Poosey, Ducky Daddles, Cocky Locky, and Henny-Penny?" And they said, "Oh, Mr. Fox, the clouds are falling, and we are going to tell the king." And the fox said, "Come with me, Turkey Lurkey, Goosey Poosey, Ducky Daddles, Cocky Locky, and Henny-Penny, and I will show you the road to the king's house." So they all gayed, and they gayed, and they gayed, till they came to the fox's hole, and the fox took them all into his hole, and he and his young cubs ate up first poor Henny-Penny, then poor Cocky Locky, then poor Ducky Daddles, then poor Goosey Poosey, and then poor Turkey Lurkey, and so they never got to the king to tell him that the clouds had fallen on the head of poor Henny-Penny. End of The Wonderful History of Henny-Penny by Anonymous. This reading was done by pumpkibee.
The House of Candy by Božena Nemcová. Translated by William Howe Tolman and Václav Smetanka. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. The House of Candy. Once upon a time there was a poor father who had 2 children, John and Mary. His daily work was to cut wood in the forest. He was very, very poor. He had no one to take care of the children. They were all alone. As he was away all day, he felt that he should marry again, so that the children should have a mother's care. But the stepmother proved to be a very cruel, neglectful woman who did not want to work. Not only did she not love the children, but she wanted to get rid of them, so she gave her husband no peace. She made up all kinds of lies about the wickedness of the children, and said that he must get rid of them. She commanded him to take them to the woods and leave them there. He was afraid of her, and at last consented. Therefore one day he said to the children with a sad heart, "Take your little baskets and come with me to the woods to pick strawberries." They jumped with joy, and at once taking their little baskets they went most happily with their father to the woods. When they were deep in the forest, the father led them to an open place where there were many berries. In fact, the place was red with the luscious fruit. "Now, dear ones," he said, "pick all the berries you please while I am away. As long as you hear me cutting wood, you will know that I am nearby." The children began eagerly to pick berries, and the father went a little ways on, where he bound his mallet on a tree. It swung back and forth in the wind, hitting the tree and making a noise like the cutting of wood. When this had been done, the father returned home, leaving the children in the woods. When John and Mary had their baskets full of berries, and had eaten their fill, they began to think of looking for their father. They went to the place where they heard the sound of the swinging mallet, but they saw nothing of their father, only the mallet hitting against the trees. This mallet was a big hammer which he used for driving in the wedges to split the logs. "Where is father?" asked John. "Perhaps he has gone home and forgotten us." Now Mary had perfect trust in her father. She could not think that he would wilfully desert them. She said to John, "Why do you think that? Surely he is somewhere near and will come for us, no doubt." So they waited for quite a while. They ate from their little baskets till the berries were all gone. Then they filled them again. And so the time was flying. Before it grew quite dark, the sound of the mallet ceased, and the children began to be frightened. They took their baskets and once more looked for father. The sun had set and evening had come. They called, "Father, where are you?" But no sound came to answer them. Mary, who was older and wiser than John, but just as much afraid, would not let him see that tears were so near her eyes. She tried to comfort him by saying, "Wait a minute, I will climb up in a tree from which I can perhaps see a light. Then we will go towards it." Up the tree she scrambled. It was so high that she could see from its top in all directions. After a while, she saw a light gleaming in the distance. "Oh, John, I see a light. Let's go towards it." Down she came, and they started. Following the light, they came to a tiny little house. It was such a funny little house. They felt of it with their hands, and then they saw that it was made of candy. John was delighted. Now he felt that he could have all the candy he wanted. At once he scrambled up on the roof to break some off to throw down to Mary, who was still afraid that some harm might come to them. But John was already on the roof, and had peeled off some candy which he had thrown down to her. They went to its little window and peeked in. There they saw an old man and an old woman sitting by the fire. At first they thought they would knock and ask for something to eat, but Mary was afraid. The moment the candy was broken off, the old woman said, "What is that? I hear a noise. Surely someone is breaking into our house. See who's there." The old man went out and saw a little girl under their window. "What are you doing here? Are you trying to break into our house?" he asked her.
"Oh no, grandfather, it is the wind,"
said Mary, her childish voice trembling with fear. With this the old man was satisfied, as he went back into the house. The children had eaten enough, and they nestled to sleep in each other's arms, under the window of the house of candy. In the morning, John climbed up on the roof to get another piece of candy. Again the old woman sent the man out to see what was going on. Mary thought to get rid of the old man once more, but this time he saw 2 children. Then he went back to tell the old woman. "Quick, quick, dear John," called Mary. "We must run away at once, or something terrible will happen to us." For she had heard the old woman command the man to catch the children, so that she could roast them for her dinner. John leapt down from the roof. Mary snatched his hand, and they ran away as fast as they could. Suddenly, John and Mary came upon a woman in a field of flax, panting and out of breath. "Tell us, please, mother, where we can hide. A bad old man from the house of candy is trying to catch us. He wants to take us home so that they can roast us for their dinner, because we have taken a piece of candy from their roof." The woman in the field was a good fairy and loved all little children. She determined to help John and Mary, so she said, "Go this way a little distance into the woods. I will see what I can do with the old man." Then she showed the children the path, along which they ran as fast as their little legs could take them. After a little while the old man came along panting and blowing. Seeing the woman in the field, he called out, "Woman, have you seen 2 children go by, and which way did they go?" The woman pretended that she was deaf. She answered, "I am in the flax field, pulling up the weeds." "Woman, I ask you, have you seen 2 children pass this way?" But she continued, "I shall weed the flax until it is ripe." Raising his voice, "Listen to me! Woman, have you seen 2 children go by here?" "When we shall have gathered the crop, we shall clean the seeds and then moisten the flax," said the woman. This time the man fairly shouted, "Stupid! Don't you understand me? Have you seen 2 children pass this way?" "When we have moistened the flax, we shall spread it out in the sun to dry," she kept on. "Woman, are you deaf? Have you seen 2 children pass this way?" "After the flax is dried, we shall comb and then hackle it." "Don't you hear? Have you seen 2 children?" "Then when the flax is hackled, we shall bind it on the distaff ready for spinning." "I don't care anything about that. Have you seen 2 children pass by here?" And with each question he grew more and more angry. "And after we have spun some fine garters, we will wind the rest of the thread on spools." "Tell me, woman, have you seen 2 children pass this way?" "When we have wound the thread on spools, we shall then weave some beautiful fine linen." "I don't care anything about the linen. I ask you again, have you seen 2 children go by here?" "When we have woven the linen, we shall bleach it. Then we shall cut it out for little shirts, swaddling cloths, skirts, and aprons." "Are you deaf?" he yelled. "Have you seen 2 children go by?" Oh yes. What are we going to do with it? Finally, we shall make tinder from it. Then the flint, when it strikes, will make a tiny spark. The fire of God will not consume it. The fire will become smoke, the smoke wind. That is the end of my story." "I did not ask you anything about that," thundered the old man. "What I want to know, did you see 2 children pass this way?" "Children? You should have told me that in the first place. Of course I saw them. They went that way, by the path through the fields, down to the brook where the willows are. But you will never catch them, for they flew like hawks." At this the woman showed the man the opposite side to which she had directed the children. Then the old man recognized that he had been outwitted. He frothed with rage and turned back home. When he had gone, the woman disappeared from the field, and the children reached home in safety. The father was very glad to get them back. End of The House of Candy. Read by Beeswaxcandle.
The Story of Miss Moppet by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. This is a pussy called Miss Moppet. She thinks she has heard a mouse. This is the mouse peeping out from behind the cupboard and making fun of Miss Moppet. He is not afraid of a kitten. This is Miss Moppet jumping just too late. She misses the mouse and hits her own head. She thinks it is a very hard cupboard. The mouse watches Miss Moppet from the top of the cupboard. Miss Moppet ties up her head in a duster and sits before the fire. The mouse thinks she is looking very ill. He comes sliding down the bell pull. Miss Moppet looks worse and worse. The mouse comes a little nearer. Miss Moppet holds her poor head in her paws and looks at him through a hole in the duster. The mouse comes very close. And then, all of a sudden, Miss Moppet jumps upon the mouse. And because the mouse has teased Miss Moppet thinks she will tease the mouse, which is not at all nice of Miss Moppet. She ties him up in the duster and tosses it about like a ball. But she forgot about that hole in the duster, and when she untied it, there was no mouse. He has wriggled out and run away, and he is dancing a jig on the top of the cupboard. End of the Story of Miss Moppet by Beatrix Potter. Read by Nora Nelson.
The Naughty Boy by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. A long time ago, there lived an old poet, a thoroughly kind old poet. As he was sitting one evening in his room, a dreadful storm arose without, and the rain streamed down from heaven. But the old poet sat warm and comfortable in his chimney corner where the fire blazed and the roasting apple hissed. Those who have not a roof over their heads will be wetted to the skin, said the good old poet. Oh, let me in, let me in. I am cold and I'm so wet, exclaimed suddenly a child that stood crying at the door and knocking for admittance while the rain poured down and the wind made all the windows rattle. Poor thing, said the old poet, as he went to open the door. There stood a little boy, quite naked, and the water ran down from his long golden hair. He trembled with cold, and had he not come into a warm room, he would most certainly have perished in the frightful tempest. Poor child, said the old poet, as he took the boy by the hand. Come in, and I will soon restore thee. Thou shalt have wine and roasted apples, for thou art verily a charming child. And the boy was so really. His eyes were like two bright stars, and although the water trickled down his hair, it waved in beautiful curls. He looked exactly like a little angel, but he was so pale, and his whole body trembled with cold. Had a nice little bow in his hand, but it was quite spoiled by the rain, and the tints of his many colored arrows ran one into the other. The old poet seated himself beside his hearth and took the little fellow on his lap. He squeezed the water out of his dripping hair, warmed his hands between his own, and boiled for him some sweet wine. Then the boy recovered. His cheeks again grew rosy. He jumped down from the lap where he was sitting and danced round the kind old poet. You are a merry fellow, said the old man. What's your name? My name is Cupid, answered the boy. Don't you know me? There lies my bow. It shoots well, I can assure you. Look, the weather is now clearing up, and the moon is shining clear again through the window. Why, your bow is quite spoiled, said the old poet. That was sad indeed, said the boy, and he took the bow in his hand and examined it on every side. Oh, it is dry again, and is not hurt at all. The string is quite tight. I will try it directly. And he bent his bow, took aim, and shot an arrow at the old poet right into his heart. You see now that my bow was not spoiled, said he, laughing, and away he ran. The naughty boy, to shoot the old poet in that way, he who had taken him into his warm room, who had treated him so kindly, and who had given him warm wine and the very best apples. The poor poet lay on the earth and wept, for the hour had really flown into his heart. Fie, said he, how naughty a boy Cupid is. I will tell all children about him, that they may take care and not play with him, for he will only cause them sorrow and many a heartache. And all good children to whom he related this story took great heed of this naughty Cupid. But he made fools of them still, for he is astonishingly cunning. When the university students come from the lectures, he runs beside them in a black coat and with a book under his arm. It is quite impossible for them to know him, and they walk along with him arm in arm, as if he too were a student like themselves. And then, unperceived, he thrusts an arrow to their bosom. When the young maidens come from being examined by the clergyman, or go to church to be confirmed, there he is again, close behind them. Yes, he is forever following people. At the play, he sits in a great chandelier and burns in bright flames, so that people think it is really a flame, but they soon discover it is something else. He roves about in the garden of the palace and upon the ramparts. Yes, once he even shot your father and mother right in the heart. Ask them only, and you will hear what they'll tell you. Oh, he is a naughty boy, that Cupid. You must never have anything to do with him. He is forever running after everybody. Only think, he shot an arrow once at your old grandmother, but that is a long time ago, and it is all past now. However, a thing of that sort she never forgets. Fie, naughty Cupid! But now you know him, and you know too how ill behaved he is. End of The Naughty Boy by Hans Christian Andersen, recording by Ronald Gardella.
A Bit of Sunshine. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. "Mama," said Kate, as she stood at the door, which she had opened to let Puss in. "May I not go out and play? The clouds are all gone and the sun shines bright and warm." "But the grass must be quite soaked after all the rain," said Mamma. "I will tell you what to do. Run to Papa and ask him if he will not take us to drive." Papa was just going out, and had his hat in his hand, but he sat down at once to hear what Kate had to say, and promised that he would take them in half an hour. And so Kate ran upstairs to ask Nurse to put her wraps on. By the time the horses were at the door, she was all ready, and took her place with great glee. What a bright afternoon it was! The long rain had made all the grass and leaves look bright and green, and they were rustling in the fresh breeze. Away out at sea, the ships were flying before the wind, looking like great white birds. Kate's home was at the seaside, and their drive this afternoon would take them for a time on the beach. The waves, Papa said, would be very wild, for the wind was just right to make a heavy surf. Soon they began to come to the fishing village. The houses were small, and on the beach close to each was drawn up a fishing boat. On one of these a man was hard at work. He was down on his knees in his shirt sleeves, with some sort of a tool in his hands, and was so intent on what he was doing that he did not raise his head as they passed. In the boat itself was a boy. He was leaning over the side and looking down at his father. His hat had blown off, and he looked like such a nice boy that Kate smiled at him as they went by. He laughed back and made her a little bow, but the horses went by so fast that she saw him for a minute only. "What was the name of that boat, Papa?" she asked. "Phyllis." said Papa. Why, that's a girl's name, said Kate. Just at that moment they passed by a small house. The door stood wide open, and in it sat a young girl. She had a pillow in her lap and was working over it, Kate thought, with a needle. She is making lace, said Mama. It is hard work, because one has to sit still bent over. I suppose she is glad to have the bright sunshine to sit in, for no doubt she has been kept in the house by the rain. I wonder if that is her little brother who is leaning against the side of the house, whittling. Kate stretched her head out to look and cried, Why, he is making a boat. What a clever boy! See, the hull is done and 2 masts are in place. What fun it would be to have a boat to sail on our little pond. Our pond is too deep for it to be safe for you to play about it, said Papa. But when you are older, you shall have a boat without fail. The road now left the village behind and ran along the top of some high cliffs. At their feet the sea came in great waves that were topped with foam, and that broke in a mass of spray. There were 2 or 3 persons on the beach, and they were walking about and holding up their skirts to keep them from getting wet. It looked like such fun that Mama asked Papa if he would not stop and let her and Kate have a short run on the sands. So the horses were brought to a halt, and they got down and made their way through a break in the cliffs to the beach. Then, after they had walked a while, they sat down on a great mass of rock and watched the waves as they rolled and broke at their feet. Kate was much interested in a piece of board that the waves were tossing about. She played that it was a ship, and really felt quite badly when it was dashed against the rocks. How long they would have stayed there I do not know, but they heard Papa shouting that he was tired of waiting, and so they made haste to climb up to where he was and take their seats. Then he spoke to the horses, and on they went. They had not gone far when they found themselves in a green lane. Coming toward them were a little girl and boy. They were on their way home from school, as the bag in the girl's hand showed, for it had books in it. As they drew up by the fence to let our party pass, Kate said, "Their mama lets them walk out though the grass is wet. But I would much rather ride this way than walk at any time, or play either, and so would they, I know." "I am afraid the rain is not all over yet," said Papa. "That black cloud ahead will give us a wetting, I fear. I will drive faster." Soon the drops began to fall, but their carriage had a top, and they had with them rugs, so that they were not hurt at all. Kate, as she peeped out, saw that all were not so safe. A girl and a boy were crouched close under a bush by the roadside. "They will not get very wet," said Mama, "for the cloud is nearly passed by, and the sun shines once more." "Are we not near home?" she said to Papa. "It is getting late, I think. There goes a girl with her pail to drive the cows to the yard to be milked. Kate must have her supper when we get back, and her bedtime is 7 o'clock, you know." "It is only 5 now," said Papa. "We can have a good hour more, and Kate won't mind, I fancy, if she is a little late for once." "No, indeed," said Kate. "I think anyway I am getting much too big to go to bed at 7. "There is a little girl," said Mama, as she looked in at the door of a house that they were passing, "that thinks bedtime is not far off." "She is only a baby," said Kate with great indignation. and I am quite a large little woman." Papa and Mama both laughed at Kate's tone. She did not like to be laughed at all, and so, to change the subject, as they went by a house, called out, "Why, what are that boy and girl doing at that hogshead?" "Fishing," said Papa soberly. "In a hogshead," said Kate. "Whoever caught fish in such a place? No, they must be sailing chips. Yes," she went on, as she stretched her short neck up as far as she could. "That is what they are doing. I can see the chips." Just then Papa called out, "What in the world is this coming down the road? Whoa! My boys, steady," he said to his horses as they began to prick up their ears. The next minute they saw what it was. A dog came toward them at full speed, howling with fright, while close at his heels was a cat wild with rage. Her ears were laid back, and she meant to catch and scratch the dog if she could. But he was too fleet for her, and as they looked, they saw Puss give up the chase and climb up on a fence. "Well," said Papa, "I think that dog has had a lesson. He will not trouble that cat again, I am sure. I wonder what he did to make her so angry. Perhaps he teased her kittens." "There," said Kate, a few minutes later, "there is a dog that is not going to be driven by a cat. Just look, Mama. He wants to get some of that baby's supper." Mama looked up and on the porch of a house saw just what you see in this picture, a fat small boy with a slice of bread and butter, while a dog almost as big as the boy looked on waiting for a bite. Just at the side gate of the house stood an old cart half full of hay. It had not been used for some time, and a pair of birds had made their nest in it and had 2 or 3 young birds, which they were just feeding with a worm. "Oh, how sweet!" cried Kate. "Papa, dear, do stop a minute." So Papa drew in his horses, and they watched them for a little while. The birds did not seem to mind them at all. "There are no bad boys hereabout," said Papa. "That is very certain." "I am quite sure," said Mama, "that it must be time for us to be home. The sun is nearly setting." "Yes," said Papa, "it is 10 minutes of 6. I will take a new way home, and we can be there in a very short time." So he turned off into a lane close at hand. The horses seemed to know that their work was nearly done, and went on so briskly that just as the hall clock struck 6, they stopped in front of the door. Nurse was waiting on the piazza to meet them, and she jumped Kate out of the carriage and took her right up to the nursery, where in a very short time her tea was all ready. How hungry she was! It seemed to her that bread and milk never tasted so good before, and she had her bowl filled 3 times. At last she pushed back her chair and said she had had enough. Then she began to tell Nurse all that she had seen, the boys and the dogs, and all the pleasant sights, and all the time that Nurse was getting her ready for bed, her small tongue wagged without stopping. "I am getting now to be such a big little woman," she said to Nurse, "that I don't think I shall go to bed any more till 8. I only just lay awake for an hour when I go at 7. But that night when Mama came up at 5 minutes past 7 to kiss her good night, she found her little girl so fast asleep that she did not know at all that she had come. "Ha ha!" laughed Mama softly. "I think we will not change the hour for Kate to go to bed just yet." The next day was bright and fair, and Kate was glad to get out once more. She found that the rain, which had seemed so useless to her, had been of great service. Her flowers were all looking fresh and green, and every bud was nodding its head in the sunlight. End of A Bit of Sunshine, read by Consortiania.
The Tale of Tom Kitten by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Once upon a time, there were 3 little kittens, and their names were Mittens, Tom Kitten, and Moppet. They had dear little fur coats of their own, and they tumbled about the doorstep and played in the dust. But one day their mother, Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit, expected friends to tea, so she fetched the kittens indoors to wash and dress them before the fine company arrived. First she scrubbed their faces. This one is Moppet. Then she brushed their fur. This one is Mittens. Then she combed their tails and whiskers. This is Tom Kitten. Tom was very naughty, and he scratched. Mrs. Tabitha dressed Moppet and Mittens in clean pinafores and tuckers, and then she took all sorts of elegant, uncomfortable clothes out of a chest of drawers in order to dress up her son Thomas. Tom Kitten was very fat, and he had grown. Several buttons burst off. His mother sewed them on again. When the 3 kittens were ready, Mrs. Tabitha unwisely turned them out into the garden, to be out of the way while she made hot buttered toast. Now keep your frocks clean, children. You must walk on your hind legs, keep away from the dirty ash pit, and from Sally Henny-Penny, and from the pigsty and the puddle ducks. Moppet and Mittens walked down the garden path unsteadily. Presently they trod upon their pinafores and fell on their noses. When they stood up, there were several green smears. "Let us climb up the rockery and sit on the garden wall," said Moppet. They turned their pinafores back to front and went up with a skip and a jump. Moppet's white tucker fell down into the road. Tom Kitten was quite unable to jump when walking upon his hind legs in trousers. He came up the rockery by degrees, breaking the ferns and shedding buttons right and left. He was all in pieces when he reached the top of the wall. Moppet and Mittens tried to pull him together. His hat fell off, and the rest of his buttons burst. While they were in difficulties, there was a pit-pat, paddle-pat, and the 3 puddle ducks came along the hard, high road, marching one behind the other and doing the goose step. Pit-pat, paddle-pat, pit-pat, waddle-pat. They stopped and stood in a row and stared up at the kittens. They had very small eyes and looked surprised. Then the 2 duck birds, Rebecca and Jemima Puddle Duck, picked up the hat and tucker and put them on. Mittens laughed so that she fell off the wall. Moppet and Tom descended after her. The pinafores and all the rest of Tom's clothes came off on the way down. "Come, Mr. Drake Puddle Duck," said Moppet. "Come and help us to dress him. Come and button up Tom." Mr. Drake Puddle Duck advanced in a slow, sideways manner and picked up the various articles. But he put them on himself. They fitted him even worse than Tom Kitten. "It's a very fine morning," said Mr. Drake Puddle Duck. And he and Jemima and Rebecca Puddle Duck set off up the road, keeping step. Pit-pat, paddle-pat, pit-pat, waddle-pat. Then Tabitha Twitchit came down the garden and found her kittens on the wall with no clothes on. She pulled them off the wall, smacked them, and took them back to the house. "My friends will arrive in a minute, and you are not fit to be seen. I am affronted," said Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit. She sent them upstairs, and I'm sorry to say she told her friends that they were in bed with the measles, which was not true. Quite the contrary. They were not in bed, not in the least. Somehow there were very extraordinary noises overhead which disturbed the dignity and repose of the tea party. And I think that some day I shall have to make another, larger book to tell you more about Tom Kitten. As for the puddle ducks, they went into a pond. The clothes all came off directly because there were no buttons. And Mr. Drake Puddle Duck and Jemima and Rebecca have been looking for them ever since. End of the Tale of Tom Kitten by Beatrix Potter. Read by Galena Rayven.
The Magic Fishbone by Charles Dickens. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Several of the children were growing out of their clothes. There was once a king, and he had a queen, and he was the manliest of his sex, and she was the loveliest of hers. The king was, in his private profession, under government. The queen's father had been a medical man out of town. They had 19 children, and were always having more. 17 of these children took care of the baby, and Alicia, the eldest, took care of them all. Their ages varied from 7 years to 7 months. Let us now resume our story. One day the king was going to the office when he stopped at the fishmonger's to buy 1.5 pounds of salmon, not too near the tail, which the queen, who was a careful housekeeper, had requested him to send home. Mr. Pickles the fishmonger said, "Certainly, sir. Is there any other article?" "Good morning." The king went on towards the office in a melancholy mood, for quarter day was such a long way off, and several of the dear children were growing out of their clothes. He had not proceeded far when Mr. Pickles' boy came running up after him and said, "Sir, you didn't notice the old lady in our shop." "What old lady?" inquired the king. Now the king had not seen any old lady, because this old lady had been invisible to him, though visible to Mr. Pickles' boy, probably because he messed and splashed the water about to that degree, and flopped the pairs of soles down in that violent manner, that if she had not been visible to him, he would have spoilt her clothes. Just then the old lady came trotting up. She was dressed in shot silk of the richest quality, smelling of dried lavender. "King Watkins the First, I believe," said the old lady. "Watkins," replied the king, "is my name." "Papa, if I'm not mistaken, of the beautiful Princess Alicia," said the old lady. "And of 18 other darlings," replied the king. "Listen, you are going to the office," said the old lady. It instantly flashed upon the king that she must be a fairy, or how could she know that? "You are right," said the old lady, answering his thoughts. "I am the good fairy Grandmarina. Attend. When you return home to dinner, politely invite the Princess Alicia to have some of the salmon you bought just now." "It may disagree with her," said the king. The old lady became so very angry at this absurd idea that the king was quite alarmed and humbly begged her pardon. "We hear a great deal too much about this thing disagreeing and that thing disagreeing," said the old lady with the greatest contempt it was possible to express. "Don't be greedy. I think you want it all yourself." The king hung his head under this reproof and said he wouldn't talk about things disagreeing any more. "Be good, then," said the fairy Grandmarina, "and don't. When the beautiful Princess Alicia consents to partake of the salmon, as I think she will, you will find she will have a fishbone on her plate. Tell her to dry it and to rub it and to polish it till it shines like mother of pearl, and take care of it as a present from me." "Is that all?" asked the king. "Don't be impatient, sir," returned the fairy Grandmarina, scolding him severely. "Don't catch people short before they have done speaking. Just the way with you grown-up persons. You are always doing it." The king again hung his head and said he wouldn't do so any more. "Be good then," said the fairy Grandmarina, "and don't. Tell the Princess Alicia, with my love, that the fishbone is a magic present which can only be used once, but it will bring her that once whatever she wishes for, provided she wishes for it at the right time. That is the message. Take care of it." "Hoity-toity me." The king was beginning, "Might I ask the reason?" when the fairy became absolutely furious. "Will you be good, sir?" she exclaimed, stamping her foot on the ground. "The reason for this and the reason for that, indeed. You are always wanting the reason. No reason. There, hoity-toity me. I am sick of your grown-up reasons." The king was extremely frightened by the old lady's flying into such a passion, and he said he was very sorry to have offended her, and he wouldn't ask for reasons any more. "Be good then," said the old lady, "and don't." With those words, Grandmarina vanished, and the king went on and on and on till he came to the office. There he wrote and wrote and wrote till it was time to go home again. Then he politely invited the Princess Alicia, as the fairy had directed him, to partake of the salmon. And when she had enjoyed it very much, he saw the fishbone on her plate, as the fairy had told him he would, and he delivered the fairy's message, and the Princess Alicia took care to dry the bone and to rub it and to polish it till it shone like mother of pearl. And so, when the queen was going to get up in the morning, she said, "Oh, dear me, my head, my head!" And then she fainted away. The Princess Alicia, who happened to be looking in at the chamber door, asking about breakfast, was very much alarmed when she saw her royal mamma in this state, and she rang the bell for Peggy, which was the name of the Lord Chamberlain. But remembering where the smelling bottle was, she climbed on a chair and got it. And after that, she climbed on another chair by the bedside and held the smelling bottle to the queen's nose. And after that, she jumped down and got some water, and after that she jumped up again and wetted the queen's forehead. And in short, when the Lady Chamberlain came in, that dear old woman said to the little princess, "What a trot you are! I couldn't have done it better myself." But that was not the worst of the good queen's illness. Oh, no, she was very ill indeed for a long time. The Princess Alicia kept the 17 young princes and princesses quiet, and dressed and undressed and danced the baby and made the kettle boil and heated the soup and swept the hearth and poured out the medicine and nursed the queen and did all that ever she could, and was as busy as busy could be. For there were not many servants at that palace for 3 reasons: because the king was short of money, because a rise in his office never seemed to come, and because quarter day was so far off that it looked almost as far off and as little as one of the stars. But on the morning when the queen fainted away, where was the magic fishbone? Why, there it was in Princess Alicia's pocket. She had almost taken it out to bring the queen to life again, when she put it back and looked for the smelling bottle. After the queen had come out of her swoon that morning and was dozing, the Princess Alicia hurried upstairs to tell a most particular secret to a most particularly confidential friend of hers, who was a duchess. People did suppose her to be a doll, but she was really a duchess, though nobody knew it except the princess. This particular secret was a secret about the Magic Fishbone, the history of which was well known to the Duchess, because the princess told her everything. The princess kneeled down by the bed on which the Duchess was lying, full dressed and wide awake, and whispered the secret to her. The Duchess smiled and nodded. People might have supposed that she never smiled and nodded, but she often did, though nobody knew it except the princess. Then the Princess Alicia hurried downstairs again to keep watch in the queen's room. She often kept watch by herself in the queen's room, but every evening while the illness lasted, she sat there watching with the king. And every evening the king sat looking at her with a cross look, wondering why she never brought out the magic fishbone. As often as she noticed this, she ran upstairs, whispered the secret to the Duchess over again, and said to the Duchess, "Besides, they think we children never have a reason or a meaning." And the Duchess, though the most fashionable Duchess that ever was heard of, winked her eye. "Alicia," said the king one evening when she wished him good night. "Yes, Papa." "What has become of the magic fishbone?" "In my pocket, Papa." "I thought you had lost it." "Oh, no, Papa." "Or forgotten it?" "No, indeed, Papa." And so another time, the dreadful little snapping pug dog next door made a rush at one of the young princes as he was on the steps coming home from school, and terrified him out of his wits, and he put his hand through a pane of glass and bled. When the 17 other princes and princesses saw him bleed, they were terrified out of their wits too, and screamed themselves black in their 17 faces all at once. But the Princess Alicia put her hands over all their 17 mouths, one after another, and persuaded them to be quiet because of the sick queen. And then she put the wounded prince's hand in a basin of fresh cold water, while they stared with their twice 17 are 34, put down 4, and carry 3 eyes. And then she looked in the hand for bits of glass, and there were fortunately no bits of glass there. And then she said to 2 chubby-legged princes who were sturdy though small, "Bring me in the royal rag bag. I must snip and stitch and cut and contrive." So those 2 princes tugged at the royal rag bag and lugged it in, and the Princess Alicia sat down on the floor with a large pair of scissors and a needle and thread, and snipped and stitched and cut and contrived, and made a bandage and put it on, and it fitted beautifully. And so, when it was all done, she saw the king, her papa, looking on by the door. "Alicia." "Yes, Papa." "What have you been doing?" "Snipping, stitching, cutting, and contriving, Papa." "Where is the magic fishbone?" "In my pocket, Papa." "I thought you had lost it." "Oh, no, Papa." "Or forgotten it?" "No, indeed, Papa." After that, she ran upstairs to the Duchess and told her what had passed, and told her the secret over again, and the Duchess shook her flaxen curls and laughed with her rosy lips. Well, and so another time the baby fell under the grate. The 17 young princes and princesses were used to it, for they were almost always falling under the grate or down the stairs, but the baby was not used to it yet, and it gave him a swelled face and a black eye. The way the poor little darling came to tumble was that he slid out of Princess Alicia's lap just as she was sitting in a great coarse apron that quite smothered her in front of the kitchen fire, beginning to peel turnips for the broth for dinner. And the way she came to doing that was that the king's cook had run away that morning with her own true love, who was a very tall but very tipsy soldier. Then the 17 young princes and princesses who cried at everything that happened, cried and roared. But the Princess Alicia, who couldn't help crying a little herself, quietly called to them to be still, on account of throwing back the queen upstairs, who was fast getting well, and said, "Hold your tongues, you wicked little monkeys, every one of you, while I examine baby." Then she examined baby and found that he hadn't broken anything, and she held cold iron to his poor dear eye and smoothed his poor dear face, and he presently fell asleep in her arms. Then she said to the 17 princes and princesses, "I am afraid to lay him down yet, lest he should wake and feel pain. Be good, and you shall all be cooks." They jumped for joy when they heard that, and began making themselves cooks' caps out of old newspapers. So to one she gave the salt box, and to one she gave the barley, and to one she gave the herbs, and to one she gave the turnips, and to one she gave the carrots, and to one she gave the onions, and to one she gave the spice box, till they were all cooks and all running about at work, she sitting in the middle smothered in the great coarse apron, nursing baby. By and by the broth was done, and the baby woke up smiling like an angel, and was trusted to the sedatest princess to hold, while the other princes and princesses were squeezed into a far-off corner to look at the Princess Alicia turning out the saucepan full of broth, for fear, as they were always getting into trouble, they should get splashed and scalded. When the broth came tumbling out, steaming beautifully, and smelling like a nosegay good to eat, they clapped their hands. That made the baby clap his hands, and that, and as looking as if he had a comic toothache, made all the princes and princesses laugh. So the Princess Alicia said, "Laugh and be good, and after dinner we will make him a nest on the floor in a corner, and he shall sit in the nest and see a dance of 18 cooks." That delighted the young princes and princesses, and they ate up all the broth, and washed up all the plates and dishes, and cleared away and pushed the table into a corner, and then in their cook's caps, and the Princess Alicia in the smothering coarse apron that belonged to the cook that had run away with her own true love, that was very tall but very tipsy soldier, danced a dance of 18 cooks before the angelic baby, who forgot his swelled face and his black eye, and crowed with joy. And so then, once more the Princess Alicia saw King Watkins the First, her father, standing in the doorway looking on, and he said, "What have you been doing, Alicia?" "Cooking and contriving, Papa." "What else have you been doing, Alicia?" "Keeping the children light-hearted, Papa." "Where is the magic fishbone, Alicia?" "In my pocket, Papa." "I thought you had lost it." "Oh, no, Papa." "Or forgotten it?" "No, indeed, Papa." The king then sighed so heavily and seemed so low-spirited and sat down so miserably, leaning his head upon his hand and his elbow upon the kitchen table pushed away in the corner, that the 17 princes and princesses crept softly out of the kitchen and left him alone with the Princess Alicia and the angelic baby. What is the matter, Papa? I am dreadfully poor, my child. Have you no money at all, Papa? None, my child. Is there no way left of getting any, Papa? No way, said the king. I have tried very hard, and I have tried all ways. When she heard those words, the Princess Alicia began to put her hand into the pocket where she kept the magic fishbone. Papa, said she, when we have tried very hard and tried all ways, we must have done our very best. No doubt, Alicia. When we have done our very best, Papa, and that is not enough, then I think the right time must have come for asking help of others. This was the very secret connected with the magic fishbone, which she had found out for herself from the good fairy Grandmarina's words, and which she had so often whispered to her beautiful and fashionable friend, the Duchess. So she took out of her pocket the magic fishbone that had been dried and rubbed and polished till it shone like mother of pearl, and she gave it one little kiss and wished it was quarter day. And immediately it was quarter day, and the king's quarter's salary came rattling down the chimney and bounced into the middle of the floor. But this was not half of what happened. No, not a quarter. For immediately afterwards the good fairy Grandmarina came riding in a carriage and 4 peacocks, with Mr. Pickles' boy up behind, dressed in silver and gold, with a cocked hat, powdered hair, pink silk stockings, a jeweled cane, and a nosegay. Down jumped Mr. Pickles' boy with his cocked hat in his hand, and wonderfully polite, being entirely changed by enchantment, and handed Grandmarina out, and there she stood in her rich shot silk, smelling of dried lavender, fanning herself with a sparkling fan. Alicia, my dear, said the charming old fairy, how do you do? I hope you are pretty well. Give me a kiss. The Princess Alicia embraced her, and then Grandmarina turned to the king and said rather sharply, Are you good? The king said he hoped so. I suppose you know the reason now why my goddaughter here, kissing the princess again, did not apply the fishbone sooner, said the fairy. The king made her a shy bow. Ah, but you didn't then, said the fairy. The king made her a shyer bow. Any more reasons to ask for? Said the fairy. The king said no, and he was very sorry. Be good then, said the fairy, and live happy ever afterwards. The Grandmarina waved her fan, and the queen came in most splendidly dressed, and the 17 young princes and princesses, no longer grown out of their clothes, came in newly fitted out from top to toe, with tucks and everything to admit of its being let out. After that, the fairy tapped the Princess Alicia with her fan, and the smothering coarse apron flew away, and she appeared exquisitely dressed like a little bride, with a wreath of orange flowers and a silver veil. After that, the kitchen dresser changed of itself into a wardrobe, made of beautiful woods and gold and looking-glass, which was full of dresses of all sorts, all for her, and all exactly fitting her. After that, the angelic baby came in, running alone, with his face and eye not a bit the worse, but much the better. Then Grandmarina begged to be introduced to the Duchess, and when the Duchess was brought down, many compliments passed between them. A little whispering took place between the fairy and the Duchess, and then the fairy said out loud, Yes, I thought she would have told you. Grandmarina then turned to the king and queen and said, "We are going in search of Prince Certain Personio. The pleasure of your company is required at church in half an hour precisely." So she and the Princess Alicia got into the carriage, and Mr. Pickles' boy handed in the Duchess, who sat by herself on the opposite seat, and then Mr. Pickles' boy put up the steps and got up behind, and the peacocks flew away with their tails spread. Prince Certain Personio was sitting by himself, eating barley sugar and waiting to be 90. When he saw the peacocks, followed by the carriage, coming in at the window, it immediately occurred to him that something uncommon was going to happen. "Prince," said Grandmarina, "I bring you your bride." The moment the fairy said those words, Prince Certain Personio's face left off being sticky, and his jacket and corduroys changed to peach bloom velvet, and his hair curled, and a cap and feather flew in like a bird and settled on his head. He got into the carriage by the fairy's invitation, and there he renewed his acquaintance with the Duchess, whom he had seen before. In the church were the prince's relations and friends, and the Princess Alicia's relations and friends, and the 17 princes and princesses, and the baby, and a crowd of the neighbors. The marriage was beautiful beyond expression. The Duchess was bridesmaid and beheld the ceremony from the pulpit, where she was supported by the cushion of the desk. Grandmarina gave a magnificent wedding feast afterwards, in which there was everything and more to eat, and everything and more to drink. The wedding cake was delicately ornamented with white satin ribbons, frosted silver and white lilies, and was 42 yards round. When Grandmarina had drunk her love to the young couple, and Prince Certain Personio had made a speech, and everybody cried, "Hip, hip, hip, hurrah!" Grandmarina announced to the king and queen that in future there would be 8 quarter days in every year except in leap year, when there would be 10. She then turned to Certain Personio and Alicia and said, "My dears, you will have 35 children, and they will all be good and beautiful. 17 of your children will be boys, and 18 will be girls. The hair of the whole of your children will curl naturally. They will never have the measles, and will have recovered from the whooping cough before being born." On hearing such good news, everybody cried out, "Hip, hip, hip, hurrah!" again. "It only remains," said Grandmarina in conclusion, "to make an end of the fishbone." So she took it from the hand of the Princess Alicia, and it instantly flew down the throat of the dreadful little snapping pug dog next door, and choked him, and he expired in convulsions. The end. End of The Magic Fishbone by Charles Dickens. Read by Kari Burns.
Theo and His Horses, Jane, Betsy and Blanche, from Menagerie Intime, by Andrew Lang. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. After Théophile grew to be a man, he wrote a great many books, which were all delightful to read, and everybody bought them. And Théophile got rich, and thought he might give himself a little carriage with 2 horses to draw it. And first he fell in love with 2 dear little Shetland ponies, who were so shaggy and hairy that they seemed all mane and tail, and whose eyes looked so affectionately at him, that he felt as if he should like to bring them into the drawing-room instead of sending them to the stable. They were charming little creatures, not a bit shy, and they would come and poke their noses into Théophile's pockets in search for sugar, which was always there. Indeed, their only fault was that they were so very, very small, and that, after all, was not their fault. Still, they looked more suited to an English child of 8 years old, or to Tom Thumb, than to a French gentleman of 40, not so thin as he once was. And as they all passed through the streets, everybody laughed, and drew pictures of them, and declared that Théophile could easily have carried a pony on each arm, and the carriage on his back. Now Théophile did not mind being laughed at, but still he did not always want to be stared at all through the streets, whenever he went out. So he sold his ponies and began to look for something nearer his own size. After a short search, he found 2 of a dapple grey colour, stout and strong, and as like each other as 2 peas, and he called them Jane and Betsy. But although, to look at, no one could ever tell one from the other, their characters were totally different, as Jane was very bold and spirited, and Betsy was terribly lazy. While Jane did all the pulling, Betsy was quite contented just to run by her side, without troubling herself in the least, and, as was only natural, Jane did not think this at all fair, and took a great dislike to Betsy, which Betsy heartily returned. At last matters became so bad that, in their efforts to get at each other, they half kicked the stable to pieces, and would even rear themselves upon their hind legs in order to bite each other's faces. Théophile did all he could to make them friends, but nothing was of any use, and at last he was forced to sell Betsy. The horse he found to replace her was a shade lighter in colour, and therefore not quite so good a match, but luckily Jane took to her at once, and lost no time in doing the honours of the stable. Every day the affection between the two became greater. Jane would lay her head on Blanche's shoulder. She had been called Blanche because of her fair skin, and when they were turned out into the stable yard, after being rubbed down, they played together like 2 kittens. If one was taken out alone, the other became sad and gloomy, till the well-known tread of its friend's hoofs was heard from afar, when it would give a joyful neigh, which was instantly answered. Never once was it necessary for the coachman to complain of any difficulty in harnessing them. They walked themselves into their proper places, and behaved in all ways as if they were well brought up, and ready to be friendly with everybody. They had all kinds of pretty little ways, and if they thought there was a chance of getting bread, or sugar, or melon rind, which they both loved, they would make themselves as caressing as a dog. No one who has lived much with animals can doubt that they talk together in a language that man is too stupid to understand. Or if anyone had doubted it, they would soon have been convinced of the fact by the conduct of Jane and Blanche when in harness. When Jane first made Blanche's acquaintance, she was afraid of nothing, but after they had been together a few months, her character gradually changed, and she had sudden panics and nervous fits, which puzzled her master greatly. The reason of this was that Blanche, who was very timid and easily frightened, passed most of the night in telling Jane ghost stories, till poor Jane learned to tremble at every sound. Often, when they were driving in the lonely alleys of the Bois de Boulogne after dark, Blanche would come to a dead stop, or shy to one side as if a ghost, which no one else could see, stood before her. She breathed loudly, trembled all over with fear, and broke into a cold perspiration. No efforts of Jane, strong though she was, could drag her along. The only way to move her steps was for the coachman to dismount, and to lead her, with his hand over her eyes, for a few steps, till the vision seemed to have melted into air. In the end, these terrors affected Jane just as if Blanche, on reaching the stable, had told her some terrible story of what she had seen. And even her master had been known to confess that when driving by moonlight down some dark road, where the trees cast strange shadows, Blanche would suddenly come to a dead halt and begin to tremble, he did not half like it himself. With this one drawback, never were animals so charming to drive. If Théophile held the reins, it was really only for the look of the thing, and not in the least because it was necessary. The smallest flick of the tongue was enough to direct them, to quicken them, to make them go to the right or to the left, or even to stop them. They were so clever that in a very short time they had learned all their master's habits, and knew his daily haunts as well as he did himself. They would go of their own accord to the newspaper office, to the printing office, to the publishers, to the Bois de Boulogne, to certain houses where he dined on certain days in the week, so very punctually that it was quite provoking. And if it ever happened that Théophile spent longer than usual at any particular place, they never failed to call his attention by loud neighs, or by pawing the ground, sounds of which he quite well knew the meaning. But, alas, the time came when a revolution broke out in Paris. People had no time to buy books or to read them. They were far too busy building barricades across the streets, or in tearing up the paving stones to throw at each other. The newspaper in which Théophile wrote, and which paid him enough money to keep his horses, did not appear any more, and sad though he was at parting, the poor man thought he was lucky to find someone to buy horses, carriage, and harness for a fourth part of their worth. Tears stood in his eyes as they were led away to their new stable. But he never forgot them, and they never forgot him. Sometimes, as he sat writing at his table, he would hear from afar a light, quick step, and then a sudden stop under the windows. And their old master would look up and sigh and say to himself, "Poor Jane, poor Blanche, I hope they are happy." End of Theo and His Horses, Jane, Betsy and Blanche by Andrew Lang. Recording by Algy Pug.
The Velveteen Rabbit by Marjorie Williams. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. There once was a Velveteen Rabbit, and in the beginning he was really splendid. He was fat and bunchy, as a rabbit should be. His coat was spotted brown and white, he had real thread whiskers, and his ears were lined with pink satin. On Christmas morning, when he sat wedged in the top of the boy's stocking, with a sprig of holly between his paws, the effect was charming. There were other things in the stocking, nuts and oranges, and a toy engine, and chocolate almonds and a chocolate mouse, but the rabbit was quite the best of all. For at least 2 hours the boy loved him, and then aunts and uncles came to dinner, and there was a great rustling of tissue paper and unwrapping of parcels. In the excitement of looking at all the new presents, the Velveteen Rabbit was forgotten. For a long time he lived in the toy cupboard or on the nursery floor, and no one thought very much about him. He was naturally shy, and being only made of velveteen, some of the more expensive toys quite snubbed him. The mechanical toys were very superior, and looked down upon everyone else. They were full of modern ideas, and pretended they were real. The model boat, who had lived through 2 seasons and lost most of his paint, caught the tone from them and never missed an opportunity of referring to his rigging in technical terms. The rabbit could not claim to be a model of anything else, for he didn't know that real rabbits existed. He thought they were all stuffed with sawdust like himself, and he understood that sawdust was quite out of date and should never be mentioned in modern circles. Even Timothy, the jointed wooden lion, who was made by the disabled soldiers and should have had broader views, put on airs and pretended he was connected with government. Between them, all the poor little rabbit was made to feel himself very insignificant and commonplace, and the only person who was kind to him at all was the Skin Horse. The Skin Horse had lived longer in the nursery than any of the others. He was so old that his brown coat was bald in patches and showed the seams underneath, and most of the hair in his tail had been pulled out to string bead necklaces. He was wise, for he had seen a long succession of mechanical toys arrive to boast and swagger, and by break their mainsprings and pass away, and he knew that they were only toys, and would never turn into anything else. For nursery magic is very strange and wonderful, and only those playthings that are old and wise and experienced, like the Skin Horse, understood all about it. "What is real?" asked the rabbit one day, when they were lying by side near the nursery fender, before Nana came to tidy the room. "Does it mean having things that buzz inside you and stick out handle?" "Real isn't how you are made," said the Skin Horse. "It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you can become real." "Does it hurt?" asked the rabbit. "Sometimes," said the Skin Horse, for he was always truthful. "When you are real, you don't mind being hurt." "Does it happen all at once, like being wound up?" he asked, "or bit by bit?" "It doesn't happen all at once," said the Skin Horse. "You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily, or have sharp edges, or who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand." "I suppose you are real?" said the rabbit, and then he wished he had not said it, for he thought the Skin Horse might be sensitive, but the Skin Horse only smiled. "The boy's uncle made me real," he said. "That was a great many years ago, but once you are real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always." The rabbit sighed. He thought it would be a long time before this magic called real happened to him. He longed to become real, to know what it felt like, and yet the idea of growing shabby and losing his eyes and whiskers was rather sad. He wished that he could become it without these uncomfortable things happening to him. There was a person called Nana who ruled the nursery. Sometimes she took no notice of the playthings lying about, and sometimes, for no reason whatever, she went swooping about like a great wind and hustled them away in cupboards. She called this tidying up, and the playthings all hated it, especially the tin ones. The rabbit didn't mind it so much, for wherever he was thrown he came down soft. One evening, when the boy was going to bed, he couldn't find the china dog that always slept with him. Nana was in a hurry, and it was too much trouble to hunt for china dogs at bedtime, so she simply looked about her, and seeing that the toy cupboard door stood open, she made a swoop. "Here," she said, "take your old bunny. He'll do to sleep with you." And she dragged the rabbit out by one ear and put him into the boy's arms. That night, and for many nights after, the Velveteen Rabbit slept in the boy's bed. At first he found it rather uncomfortable, for the boy hugged him very tight, and sometimes he rolled over on him, and sometimes he pushed him so far under the pillow that the rabbit could scarcely breathe. And he missed, too, those long moonlit hours in the nursery, when all the house was silent, and his talks with the Skin Horse. But very soon he grew to like it, for the boy used to talk to him, and made nice tunnels for him under the bedclothes that he said were like the burrows the real rabbits lived in. And they had splendid games together, in whispers, when Nana had gone away to her supper and left the night light burning on the mantelpiece. And when the boy dropped off to sleep, the rabbit would snuggle down close under his little warm chin and dream, with the boy's hands clasped close round him all night long. And so time went on, and the little rabbit was very happy, so happy that he never noticed how his beautiful velveteen fur was getting shabbier and shabbier, and his tail becoming unsewn, and all the pink rubbed off his nose where the boy had kissed him. Spring came, and they had long days in the garden, for wherever the boy went the rabbit went to. He had rides in the wheelbarrow, and picnics on the grass, and lovely fairy huts built for him under the raspberry canes behind the flower border. And once, when the boy was called away suddenly to go out to tea, the rabbit was left out on the lawn until long after dusk, and Nana had to come and look for him with the candle, because the boy couldn't go to sleep unless he was there. He was wet through with the dew, and quite earthy from diving into the burrows the boy had made for him in the flower bed, and Nana grumbled as she rubbed him off with a corner of her apron. "You must have your old bunny," she said. "Fancy all that fuss for a toy." The boy sat up in bed and stretched out his hands. "Give me my bunny," he said. "You mustn't say that. He isn't a toy. He's real." When the little rabbit heard that, he was happy, for he knew that what the Skin Horse had said was true at last. The nursery magic had happened to him, and he was a toy no longer. He was real. The boy himself had said it. That night he was almost too happy to sleep, and so much love stirred in his little sawdust heart that it almost burst, and into his boot-button eyes that had long ago lost their polish there came a look of wisdom and beauty, so that even Nana noticed it next morning when she picked him up and said, "I declare if that old bunny hasn't got quite a knowing expression." That was a wonderful summer. Near the house where they lived there was a wood, and in the long June evenings the boy liked to go there after tea to play. He took the Velveteen Rabbit with him, and before he wandered off to pick flowers or play at brigands among the trees, he always made the rabbit a little nest somewhere among the bracken, where he would be quite cozy, for he was a kind-hearted little boy, and he liked Bunny to be comfortable. One evening, while the rabbit was laying there alone, watching the ants that ran to and fro between his velvet paws in the grass, he saw two strange beings creep out of the tall bracket near him. They were rabbits, like himself, but quite furry and brand new. They must have been very well made, for their seams didn't show at all, and they changed shape in a queer way when they moved. One minute they were long and thin, and the next minute fat and bunchy. Instead of always staying the same like he did, their feet patted softly on the ground, and they crept quite close to him, twitching their noses, while the rabbit stared hard to see which side the clockwork struck out, for he knew that people who jump generally have something to wind them up. But he couldn't see it. They were evidently a new kind of rabbit altogether. They stared at him, and the little rabbit stared back, and all the time their noses twitched. "Why don't you get up and play with us?" one of them asked. "I don't feel like it," said the rabbit, for he didn't want to explain that he had no clockwork. "Ho!" said the furry rabbit. "It's as easy as anything," and he gave a big hop sideways and stood on his hind legs. "I don't believe you can," he said. "I can," said the little rabbit. "I can jump higher than anything." He meant when the boy threw him, but of course he didn't want to say so. "Can you hop on your hind legs?" asked the furry rabbit. That was a dreadful question, for the Velveteen Rabbit had no hind legs at all. The back of him was made all in one piece, like a pincushion. He sat still in the bracken and hoped that the other rabbits wouldn't notice. "I don't want to," he said again. But the wild rabbits have very sharp eyes, and this one stretched out his neck and looked. "He hasn't got hind legs!" he called out. "Fancy a rabbit without any hind legs!" and he began to laugh. "I have!" cried the little rabbit. "I have got hind legs. I am sitting on them." "Then stretch them out and show me, like this," said the wild rabbit, and began to whirl around and dance, till the little rabbit got quite dizzy. "I don't like dancing," he said. "I'd rather sit still." But all the while he was longing to dance, for a funny new tickly feeling ran through him, and he felt he would give anything in the world to be able to jump about like these rabbits did. The strange rabbit stopped dancing and came quite close. He came so close this time that his whiskers brushed the Velveteen Rabbit's ear, and then he wrinkled his nose suddenly and flattened his ears and jumped backwards. "He doesn't smell right!" he exclaimed. "He isn't a rabbit at all! He isn't real!" "I am real!" said the little rabbit. "I am real! The boy said so!" And he nearly began to cry. Just then there was a sound of footsteps, and the boy ran past near them. And with a stamp of feet and a flash of white tails the two strange rabbits disappeared. "Come back and play with me!" called the little rabbit. "Oh, do come back! I know I'm real!" But there was no answer, only the little ants ran to and fro, and the bracken swayed gently where the two strangers had passed. The Velveteen Rabbit was all alone. "Oh dear," he thought, "why did they run away like that? Why couldn't they stop and talk to me?" For a long time he lay very still, watching the bracken, and hoping that they would come back, but they never returned. And presently the sun sank lower, and the little white moths fluttered out, and the boy came and carried him home. Weeks passed, and the little rabbit grew very old and shabby, but the boy loved him just as much. He loved him so hard that he loved all his whiskers off, and the pink lining to his ears turned gray, and his brown spots faded. He even began to lose his shape, and he scarcely looked like a rabbit any more, except to the boy. To him he was always beautiful, and that was all that the little rabbit cared about. He didn't mind how he looked to other people, because the nursery magic had made him real, and when you are real, shabbiness doesn't matter. And then, one day, the boy was ill. His face grew very flushed, and he talked in his sleep, and his little body was so hot that it burned the rabbit when he held him close. Strange people came and went in the nursery, and a light burned all night, and through it all the little Velveteen Rabbit lay there, hidden from sight under the bedclothes, and he never stirred, for he was afraid that if they found him someone might take him away, and he knew that the boy needed him. It was a long, weary time, for the boy was too ill to play, and the little rabbit found it rather dull with nothing to do all day long. But he snuggled down patiently, and looked forward to the time when the boy should be well again, and they would go out in the garden amongst the flowers and the butterflies and play splendid games in the raspberry thicket like they used to. All sorts of delightful things he planned, and while the boy lay half asleep, he crept up close to the pillow and whispered them in his ear. and presently the fever turned, and the boy got better. He was able to sit up in his bed and look at picture books, while the little rabbit cuddled close at his side, and one day they let him get up and dress. It was a bright sunny morning, and the window stood wide open. They had carried the boy out onto the balcony, wrapped in a shawl, and the little rabbit lay tangled up among the bedclothes, thinking. The boy was going to the seaside tomorrow. Everything was arranged, and now it only remained to carry out the doctor's orders. They talked about it all, while the little rabbit lay under the bedclothes, with just his head peeping out, and listened. The room was to be disinfected, and all the books and toys that the boy had played with in bed must be burnt. Hurrah, thought the little rabbit, tomorrow we shall go to the seaside. For the boy had often talked of the seaside, and he wanted very much to see the big waves coming in, and the tiny crabs, and the sand castle. Just then Nana caught sight of him. How about his old bunny, she asked. That, said the doctor. Why, it's a mass of scarlet fever germs. Burn it at once. What nonsense! Get him a new one. He mustn't have that any more. And so the little rabbit was put into a sack with the old picture books and a lot of rubbish, and carried out to the end of the garden behind the fowl house. That was a fine place to make a bonfire, only the gardener was too busy just then to attend to it. He had the potatoes to dig and the green peas to gather, but next morning he promised to come quite early and burn the whole lot. That night the boy slept in a different bedroom, and he had a new bunny to sleep with. It was a splendid bunny, all white plush with real glass eyes, but the boy was too excited to care very much about it, for tomorrow he was going to the seaside, and that in itself was such a wonderful thing that he could not think of anything else. And while the boy was asleep, dreaming of the seaside, the little rabbit lay among the old picture books in the corner behind the fowl house, and he felt very lonely. The sack had been left untidied, and so by wriggling a bit he was able to get his head through the opening and look out. He was shivering a little, for he had always been used to sleeping in a proper bed, and by this time his coat had worn so thin and threadbare from hugging that it was no longer any protection to him. Near by he could see the thicket of raspberry canes, growing tall and close like a tropical jungle, in whose shadow he had played with the boy on bygone mornings. He thought of those long sunlit hours in the garden, how happy they were, and a great sadness came over him. He seemed to see them all pass before him, each more beautiful than the other, the fairy huts in the flower bed, the quiet evenings in the wood when he lay in the bracken, and the little ants ran over his paws, the wonderful day when he first knew that he was real. He thought of the skin horse, so wise and gentle, and all that he had told him. Of what use was it to be loved and lose one's beauty, and become real if it all ended like this? And a tear, a real tear, trickled down his little shabby velvet nose, and fell to the ground. And then a strange thing happened, for where the tear had fallen a flower grew out of the ground, a mysterious flower, not at all like any that grew in the garden. It had slender green leaves the color of emeralds, and in the center of the leaves a blossom like a golden cup. It was so beautiful that the little rabbit forgot to cry, and just lay there watching it. And presently the blossom opened, and out of it there stepped a fairy. She was quite the loveliest fairy in the whole world. Her dress was of pearl and dewdrops, and there were flowers round her neck and in her hair, and her face was like the most perfect flower of all. And she came close to the little rabbit, and gathered him up in her arms, and kissed him on his velveteen nose that was all damp from crying. "Little rabbit," she said, "don't you know who I am?" The rabbit looked up at her, and it seemed to him that he had seen her face before, but he couldn't think where. "I am the nursery magic fairy," she said. "I take care of all the playthings that the children have loved. When they are old and worn out, and the children don't need them any more, then I come and take them away with me, and turn them into real." "Wasn't I real before?" asked the little rabbit. "You were real to the boy," the fairy said, "because he loved you. Now you shall be real to everyone." And she held the little rabbit close in her arms, and flew with him into the wood. It was light now, for the moon had risen. All the forest was beautiful, and the fronds of the bracken shone like frosted silver. In the open glade between the tree trunks, the wild rabbits danced with their shadows on the velvet grass. But when they saw the fairy, they all stopped dancing and stood round in a ring to stare at her. "I have brought you a new playfellow," the fairy said. "You must be very kind to him and teach him all he needs to know in Rabbitland, for he is going to live with you for ever and ever." And she kissed the little rabbit again and put him down on the grass. "Run and play, little rabbit," she said. But the little rabbit sat quite still for a moment and never moved, for when he saw all the wild rabbits dancing round him, he suddenly remembered about his hind legs, and he didn't want them to see that he was made all in one piece. He did not know that when the fairy had kissed him that last time, she had changed him altogether, and he might have sat there for a long time, too shy to move, if just then something hadn't tickled his nose, and before he thought what he was doing, he lifted his hind toe to scratch it. And then he found that he actually had hind legs. Instead of dingy velveteen, he had brown fur, soft and shiny. His ears twitched by themselves, and his whiskers were so long that they brushed the grass. He gave one leap, and the joy of using those hind legs was so great that he went springing about the turf on them, jumping sideways and whirling round as the others did, and he grew so excited that when at last he did stop to look for the fairy, she had gone. He was a real rabbit at last, at home with the other rabbits. Autumn passed, and winter, and in the spring, when the days grew warm and sunny, the boy went out to play in the wood behind the house, and while he was playing, 2 rabbits crept out from the bracket and peeped at him. One of them was brown all over, but the other had strange markings under his fur, as though long ago he had been spotted, and the spots still showed through. And about his little soft nose and his round black eyes there was something familiar, so that the boy thought to himself, "Why, he looks just like my old bunny that was lost when I had scarlet fever." But he never knew that it really was his own bunny, come back to look at the child who had first helped him to be real. End of The Velveteen Rabbit by Marjorie Williams. Recording by Xander Webb.
The Wise Gray Cat by Carolyn Hoffman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. The Wise Gray Cat. Once there was a wise gray cat who lived in a cottage near the forest. She often sat in her doorway on pleasant days, smoothing her shining coat with her tongue and watching the passerby. One summer afternoon, while she was sitting there in the warm sunshine, she heard a small, strange sound. It was like nothing that she had ever heard in all her lives, for she had already lived 7 of her 9 lives, and having very sharp ears, had heard a great deal. Tick, 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 came the little noise again. Wise Gray Cat heard it quite plainly, but though she cocked her head on one side and listened carefully, she had no idea what it could be. So she called her friend Happy-Go-Hop, the frog. Happy-Go-Hop came springing along with his flute tucked under his arm, for he had been practicing a new tune down by the silvery pond. "Listen, Happy-Go-Hop," said Gray Cat. "What do you hear?" Tick, 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 the little noise kept saying down in the grass. "It must be grass growing," said Happy-Go-Hop, shutting one eye and listening. "I never heard the grass growing," said the Wise Gray Cat, "but I cannot think it sounds like that." "I will ring the chimes and call the little people," suggested Happy-Go-Hop. "They can tell us." So he went down to the edge of the pond where the bluebells grew, and he shook one of the stems till all the tiny bells rang the merriest chime you ever heard. The next minute the air was filled with wee shimmering things, pale green and thin, so that you could see right through them, and a minute after a crowd of little people had gathered around Wise Gray Cat and Happy-Go-Hop. "Little people," said Wise Gray Cat, "we should like to know, if you please, how the grass sounds when it is growing." "Does it sound like that?" asked the frog. All the little people took off their caps so they could hear the tick-tick sound better. "Not at all," said one of the little people. "Not at all," echoed all the others. They listened for a moment, then they all scampered over to a tuft of long grass, and they joined hands and danced around it in a ring. As they danced they sang, "Listen if you must be told, it is a little watch of gold." "A gold watch!" exclaimed Wise Gray Cat, much excited. "Brump, brump," began Happy-Go-Hop. "I thought of that. We must find the owner. Brump, brump," said Happy-Go-Hop. "Yes, indeed, we must find the owner," echoed all the little people. So they hung the watch on a strong reed that the frog brought from the edge of the silvery pond, and 6 of the little people lifted it onto their shoulders, and away they started to find the owner of the tiny gold watch. They walked where the ground was smooth, so they would not jar it, and Wise Gray Cat and Happy Go Hop followed along close behind to inquire of the people they met. They went on through a meadow and met Funny Bunny, the brown rabbit. "Funny Bunny," asked Wise Gray Cat, "have you lost a little gold watch?" "No, Mrs. Wise Cat," answered Funny Bunny. "Ask all you meet and see what they say. If you do not find out, I will tell you a way." And before they could ask him another question, he whisked his hind legs in the air and raced off so fast that they could not overtake him. Soon they came to Black Bear's hut and found him sitting in his doorway reading a paper. "Black Bear," said Wise Gray Cat, "do you know anyone who has lost a little gold watch?" And Happy Go Hop added, "We have found one, you see, and we are looking for the owner." Black Bear put on his big horn-rimmed spectacles and looked all through the lost and found column of his paper. But nobody there had lost or found a gold watch, or at least nobody had advertised one. At this, Wise Gray Cat, for all her wisdom, felt very much discouraged. But Happy Go Hop said, "Oh, cheer up, Mrs. Wise Gray Cat. We shall find the owner before the little watch needs winding again." So they went on until they came to the Badger's home in the heart of the forest, and there stood Badger at work at a workbench in the front of his house, and he was trying to make a tiny violin. "Good day, Mr. Badger," said Mrs. Wise Gray Cat. "Do you happen to know anyone who has lost a little gold watch?" "Cannot you guess?" asked the Badger, looking very, very wise indeed. "I cannot guess," answered Wise Gray Cat with a puzzled air. "I cannot guess," said Happy Go Hop, popping his eyes very wide open in his effort to think. Just then one of the little people took off his cap and swung it in the air and cried, "I know whom you mean. It is Fee-Fay." Then all the little people took off their caps and swung them in the air and echoed, "Fee-Fay." And they shouted it so very loud that the Wise Gray Cat's ears rang with their shrill little voices. "Why do you want Fee-Fay?" said a sweet small voice just above their heads, and they all looked up. And there, sure enough, was Fee-Fay riding on her white bumblebee. "We should like to know, if you please, Fee-Fay, who has lost a little gold watch," said Wise Gray Cat. "Of course, I will tell you very willingly," answered Fee-Fay. "But first you must show me the little gold watch." So the little people carried the watch to Fee-Fay, and then she said, "Mrs. Wise Gray Cat, will you please open the case?" Then Wise Gray Cat opened the case of the watch with her clever paws, and Fee-Fay passed her wand across the face of it 3 times. At once there appeared a picture of the little girl to whom the watch belonged. And who do you think it was? Why, it was little Princess Finette. "It is Princess Finette," said Fee-Fay, "and she will be very unhappy if she has lost her little gold watch. We must send the little gold watch to Princess Finette at once," cried all the little people. "Brump, brump," began Happy Go Hop. "Who will take it up to the castle?" "Wait a moment," said Wise Gray Cat, shaking her head. "What are we waiting for?" blustered Happy Go Hop. "Little Princess Finette will be sad when she finds her watch is lost. It should be returned to her at once."
But the little people said nothing, for they had learned to respect Wise Grey Cat, and she was saying nothing, only shaking her head. Finally she spoke in a sad tone of voice. "If you will all sit down," she said very soberly, "I will tell you the story of my life." Now Happy-Go-Hop did not care much for stories unless he was telling them himself, so he started in "Brump, brump," and was probably going to make another objection had not the little people chorused, "Yes, tell us the story of your life. Tell us the story of your life." So they all made a fairy ring around Wise Grey Cat, while Happy-Go-Hop found a comfortable damp spot under the edge of a stone, and everybody looked polite and listened as hard as possible. Wise Grey Cat sat up very straight in the middle of the circle and licked her whiskers, and then she began. "A long, long time ago, 7 lifetimes ago, for I have 2 more left of my 9 lives, I was a kitten, and I belonged to the wife of the gardener up at the castle, where lives little Princess Finette. The gardener's wife was good to me, and I had a fine time lapping cream and playing with my tail until I was a full-grown cat. It was then that a terrible adventure befell me. One day, when I was sleeping harmlessly in the sun, I was rudely awakened to find I had been pushed into a dirty sack by a gang of rude small boys. I felt myself being carried along by these wicked boys, who were talking about what further fearful things they were going to do to me. Just when I was near to having a fit with the terror of it all, I heard a man's voice. Never shall I forget my great relief. Men are not always kind, but they are never so cruel as some boys. The man asked the boys what they had there, made them stop, and took the sack from them. When he began to speak to me gently, in the tone which my master and mistress had always used toward me, I grew quiet at once. Then he untied the sack, and I gave one great leap. "Brah, toodle, oodle," came a sound from the damp spot under the edge of the stone. Happy-Go-Hop was quietly thinking over the new tune he had been practicing down by the silvery pond, and not caring in the least for stories except the ones he told himself. He had so far forgotten his manners as to begin trying it again upon his flute. Wise Grey Cat got up indignantly and turned around with her back toward Happy-Go-Hop. Then she sat down again and repeated, "As I was saying, when I was interrupted, I gave one great leap out of the mouth of the bag and over the man's arms. I must have leaped as high as the top of the gardener's cottage." "Brrr," croaked Happy-Go-Hop, but Wise Grey Cat did not appear to hear. "I was a great leaper in those days," she continued. "You must have been," agreed all the little people. Wise Grey Cat smiled a wise smile and went on. "When I came down, I ran for the forest, ran away into the middle of the deepest, darkest part, and there I have stayed in the woodcutter's cottage ever since." "Brrrr, if you please," asked Happy-Go-Hop, "what has all this to do with the little gold watch?" Wise Grey Cat turned sharply around and looked at him. "That is the first sensible thing you have said this afternoon, but if you could have waited a moment, I was coming to it. You may be sure I never forgot the face of the kind man who let me out of that bag. He is one of the footmen at the castle, and whenever he passes in the path by the forest, it makes me feel so good just to see him that I purr a long time. This very day I saw him go by with an armful of parcels. It was not long after that I heard the tick, 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 tick in the grass, and I am very much afraid that it was he who dropped the little gold watch which belongs to Princess Finette." "Oh, let us take it back to her at once," cried the little people. "But do you not see," said the Wise Grey Cat, "if we take it back to the princess, her father, the king, will know that it has been lost, and the faithful footman will be in as deep trouble as I was the day that the boys put me in the terrible bag. If the footman lost the little gold watch, he will be coming to look for it. The best thing to do is carry it back and put it in the grass where it was in the first place. The footman is faithful, and he will return and find it and take it straight to Princess Finette. At this all the little people were so delighted that they joined hands once more and danced around the watch singing, "Take the watch back along the same track. The footman will come and carry it home. Then nothing will fret, dear Princess Finette." The moment they were through with their song, they took up the reed, hung the watch upon it, and skipped lightly away through the deep shade of the forest, with Wise Grey Cat and Happy Go Hop hurrying behind. When they reached the place where they had found the watch at first, Wise Grey Cat showed the little people where to hide it, in the grass at the foot of an old stump, near to the path, but where it would not be seen and picked up by a stranger. In a short while they heard steps coming along the path, for all the people of the forest can hear much better than we can. Sure enough, it was the footman approaching, with bent head examining every inch of the ground. At once Wise Grey Cat began to purr. Happy Go Hop stopped tootling, and the little people left off their game and hung poised in the air to see what was going to happen. The footman was far too worried to notice Wise Grey Cat. He did not see Happy Go Hop at all, and his eyes were not sharp enough to make out anything as small as the little people, though if he had happened to catch sight of them, he would have supposed they were only midges. So he went on with his search, never thinking how many friendly eyes were watching him and hoping he would come upon the watch. Once he went so near to the place where the watch lay that the little people's wings trembled with joy. Wise Grey Cat stood up on a log, and as for Happy Go Hop, he blushed perfectly orange under his chin with excitement. But the footman did not see the watch, and its merry tick, 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 tick was so small that he could not hear it. At last he gave up hunting and sat down right on the old stump beside which the watch was hidden. He put his head in his hands and sat there for what seemed a very long time, looking so discouraged and dreadfully worried. "If only it had not been Princess Finette's birthday," he said to himself at last, "I should not have cared so much. But she was so disappointed when she opened her gifts and did not find the little gold watch for which she has been wishing. She will never say a word, for she is too sweet a little princess to complain. But when the old king finds out that the watch is lost and that his little daughter has been disappointed, I do not know whatever will happen to me. Oh dear, how could I have been so careless?" At this the little people could stand it no longer. They were very much afraid that the footman would go away without finding the watch after all. Suddenly the largest of the little people screamed out, "Fee-Fay! Fee-Fay!" For there she was riding past on her white bumblebee. It was such a tiny little scream that the footman did not hear it at all, but Fee-Fay heard and guided the white bumblebee nearer, while the largest of the little people told the story just as fast as he could. The footman heard that, but he thought it was the singing of a mosquito. As soon as Fee-Fay understood what was the matter, she said, "Why, that is very simple. Wait just a moment." Then she flew over and waved her tiny wand across the eyes and ears of the footman, and at once he could see and hear as well as any of the forest people, as well even as the Wise Grey Cat. Then Fee-Fay flew away on her white bumblebee, for she had done all she could. At once the footman raised his head and his eyes began to shine. "What is that?" he said, for just as plainly as could be, because Fifi had made his ears so sharp, he heard the little gold watch concealed in the grass going tick, 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 tick. He looked down at the side of the old stump, and just as plainly as could be, because Fifi had made his eyes so sharp, he saw the little gold watch shining through the grass. Then the faithful footman gave a happy shout and picked up the watch and waved it in the air. Oh, if only Princess Finette were here this minute, so that I might give it into her hands. But she has gone driving, and I shall have to wait. Why, there's the carriage now. Sure enough, along the smooth, broad road that runs past the forest was passing the blue and gold coach of the Princess Finette. The wise gray cat and Happy Go Hop and all the little people could hear the coachman blowing his gold trumpet, and they could see the coach shining through the trees. They could even see Wee Dog sitting beside the coachman up on the high seat. The footman gave another glad shout. Such a loud, glad shout that the coachman reined in the white horses and stopped the coach, and there they could all see the sweet face of little Princess Finette as she leaned out of the window to see what all this joyful noise was about. Then the footman jumped right over the wise gray cat, who was purring about his feet, and ran to the carriage, with all the little people and Happy Go Hop and the wise gray cat watching to see what would happen. The footman handed the watch to the princess with a very low bow. She laughed in delight and then clapped her hands and kissed it, so pleased to have it for her birthday after all. At once the coachman blew his gold trumpet. The faithful footman jumped up behind the coach, and away they went, shining and glittering, blue and gold, between the trunks of the trees, with Wee Dog wagging his tail and barking like mad. "Brump," said Happy Go Hop. "I knew the footman would find it." But nobody paid the least attention to him. The little people flew away laughing so loudly that it sounded like a peal of tiny bells, and the wise gray cat strolled toward the woodcutter's cottage, purring such a great big shaking purr that it made all the leaves on the trees clap their hands. As for the faithful footman, he told Princess Finette everything that had happened to the little gold watch as far as he knew, which was not half so much as we know about it. And when the old king, who was growing very old and could no longer hear very well or see very well, found out what wonderful sight and hearing belonged to the footman, he made him his body servant. That means that the faithful footman always goes about with the king now, and has the most delicious things to eat, and wears a red velvet suit, and carries a big shining sword. End of The Wise Gray Cat by Carolyn Hoffman. Read by Christine Rottger, May 3rd, 2023, Westford, Massachusetts.
The Story of the Three Little Pigs by L. Leslie Brooke. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. The Story of the Three Little Pigs. Once upon a time there was an old sow with 3 little pigs, and as she had not enough to keep them, she sent them out to seek their fortune. The first that went off met a man with a bundle of straw, and said to him, "Please, man, give me that straw to build me a house," which the man did, and the little pig built a house with it. Presently came along a wolf, and knocked at the door, and said, little pig, let me come in." To which the pig answered, "No, no, by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in," said the wolf. So he huffed, and he puffed, and he blew his house in, and ate up the little pig. The second pig met a man with a bundle of furs, and said, "Please, man, give me that furs to build a house," which the man did, and the pig built his house. Then along came the wolf and said, little pig, let me come in." "No, no, by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Then I'll puff, and I'll huff, and I'll blow your house in." So he huffed, and he puffed, and he puffed, and he huffed, and at last he blew the house down and ate up the second little pig. The third little pig met a man with a load of bricks, and said, "Please, man, give me those bricks to build a house with." So the man gave him the bricks, and he built his house with them. So the wolf came, as he did to the other little pigs, and said, little pig, let me come in." "No, no, by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in." Well, he huffed, and he puffed, and he huffed, and he puffed, and he puffed, and he huffed, but he could not get the house down. When he found that he could not, with all his huffing and puffing, blow the house down, he said, little pig, I know where there is a nice field of turnips." "Where?" said the little pig. "Oh, in Mr. Smith's home field, and if you will be ready tomorrow morning, I will call for you, and we will go together and get some for dinner." "Very well," said the little pig. "I will be ready. What time do you mean to go?" "Oh, at 6 o'clock." Well, the little pig got up at 5, and got the turnips, and was home again before 6. When the wolf came, he said, "Little pig, are you ready?" "Ready," said the little pig. "I have been and come back again, and got a nice potful for dinner." The wolf felt very angry at this, but thought that he would be up to the little pig somehow or other. So he said, little pig, I know where there is a nice apple tree." "Where?" said the pig. "Down at Merry Garden," replied the wolf, "and if you will not deceive me, I will come for you at 5 o'clock tomorrow, and we will go together and get some apples." Well, the little pig woke at 4 the next morning, and bustled up and went off for the apples, hoping to get back before the wolf came. But he had further to go, and had to climb the tree, so that just as he was coming down from it, he saw the wolf coming, which, as you may suppose, frightened him very much. When the wolf came up, he said, "Little pig, what? Are you here before me? Are they nice apples?" "Yes, yes," said the little pig, "I will throw you down one." And he threw it so far that, while the wolf was gone to pick it up, the little pig jumped down and ran home. The next day the wolf came again and said to the little pig, "Little pig, there is a fair in the town this afternoon. Will you go?" "Oh, yes," said the pig, "I will go. What time shall you be ready?" "At 3," said the wolf. So the little pig went off before the time, as usual, and got to the fair, and bought a butter churn, and was on his way home with it when he saw the wolf coming. Then he could not tell what to do, so he got into the churn to hide, and in doing so turned it round, and it began to roll, and rolled down the hill with the pig inside it, which frightened the wolf so much that he ran home without going to the fair. He went to the little pig's house, and told him how frightened he had been by a great round thing which came down the hill past him. Then the little pig said, "Ha! I frightened you, didn't I? I had been to the fair and bought a butter churn, and when I saw you I got into it and rolled down the hill." Then the wolf was very angry indeed, and declared that he would eat up the little pig, and that he would get down the chimney after him. When the little pig saw what he was about, he hung on the pot full of water, and made up a blazing fire, and just as the wolf was coming down, took off the cover of the pot, and in fell the wolf. And the little pig put on the cover again in an instant, boiled him up, and ate him for supper, and lived happily ever after. End of the story of the 3 Little Pigs by L. Leslie Brooke. Read by Jenny Curtis.
Ting-A-Ling and the Five Magicians by Frank R. Stockton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ting-A-Ling and the Five Magicians. Ting-A-Ling, for some weeks after the death of his young companion, Ling-A-Ting, seemed quite sad and dejected. He spent nearly all his time lying in a half-opened rosebud and thinking about the dear little creature who was gone. But one morning, the bud having become a full-blown rose, its petals fell apart and dropped little Ting-A-Ling out on the grass. The sudden fall did not hurt him, but it roused him to exertion, and he said, "Oh ho, this will never do. I will go up to the palace and see if there is anything going on." So off he went to the great palace, and sure enough, something was going on. He had scarcely reached the courtyard when the bells began to ring, the horns to blow, the drums to beat, and crowds of people to shout and run in every direction, and there was never such a noise and hubbub before. Ting-A-Ling slipped along close to the wall so that he would not be stepped on by anybody, and having reached the palace, he climbed up a long trailing vine into one of the lower windows. There he saw the vast audience chamber filled with people, shouting and calling and talking all at once. The Grand Vizier was on the wide platform of the throne making a speech, but the uproar was so great that not one word of it could Ting-A-Ling hear. The king himself was by his throne, putting on the bulky boots, which he only wore when he went to battle, and which made him look so terrible that a person could hardly see him without trembling. The last time that he had worn those boots, as Ting-A-Ling very well knew, he had made war on a neighboring country, and had defeated all the armies, killed all the people, torn down all the towns and cities, and every house and cottage, and plowed up the whole country, and sowed it with thistles, so that it could never be used as a country any more. So Ting-A-Ling thought that as the king was putting on his war boots, something very great was surely about to happen. Hearing a fizzing noise behind him, he turned around, and there was the prince in the courtyard, grinding his sword on a grindstone, which was turned by two slaves, who were working away so hard and fast that they were nearly ready to drop. Then he knew that wonderful things were surely coming to pass, for in ordinary times the prince never lifted his finger to do anything for himself. Just then a little page, who had been sent for the king's spurs and couldn't find them, and who was therefore afraid to go back, stopped to rest himself for a minute against the window where Ting-A-Ling was standing. As his head just reached a little above the window seat, Ting-A-Ling went close to his ear and shouted to him to please tell him what was the matter. The page started at first, but seeing it was only a little fairy, he told him that the princess was lost, and that the whole army was going out to find her. Before he could say anything more, the king was heard to roar for his spurs, and away ran the little page. Whether to look again for the spurs or to hide himself is not known at the present day. Ting-A-Ling now became very much excited. The Princess Alphalia, who had been married to the prince but a month ago, was very dear to him, and he felt that he must do something for her. But while he was thinking about what this something might possibly be, he heard the clear and distinct sound of a tiny bell, which, however, no one but a fairy could possibly have heard above all that noise. He knew it was the bell of the fairy queen, summoning her subjects to her presence, and in a moment he slid down the vine and scampered away to the gardens. There, although the sun was shining brightly and the fairies seldom assembled but by night, there were great crowds of them, all listening to the queen, and keeping much better order than the people in the king's palace. The queen addressed them in soul-stirring strains, and urged everyone to do their best to find the missing princess. In the night she had been taken away, while the prince and everybody were asleep. "And now," said the queen, untying her scarf and holding it up, Away with you, every one! Search every house, garden, mountain, and plain in the land, and the first one who comes to me with news of the Princess Ophelia shall wear my scarf." And as this was a mark of high distinction and conveyed privileges of which there was no time now to tell, the fairies gave a great cheer, which would have sounded to you, had you heard it, like a puff of wind through a thicket of reeds, and they all rushed away in every direction. Now, though the fairies of this tribe could go almost anywhere, through small cracks and keyholes, under doors, and into places where no one else could possibly penetrate, they did not fly or float in the air or anything of that sort. When they wished to travel fast or far, they would mount on butterflies and all sorts of insects, but they seldom needed such assistance, as they were not in the habit of going far from their homes in the palace gardens. Ting-A-Ling ran as fast as he could to where a friend of his, whom we have mentioned before, kept grasshoppers and butterflies to hire. But he found he was too late. Every one of them was taken by the fairies who had got there before him. "Never mind," said Ting-A-Ling to himself, "I'll catch a wild one." And borrowing a bridle, he went out into the meadows to catch a grasshopper for himself. He soon perceived one quietly feeding under a clover blossom. Ting-A-Ling slipped up softly behind him, but the grasshopper heard him and rolled his big eyes backward, drawing in his hind legs in the way which all boys know so well. "What's the good of his seeing all around him?" thought Ting-A-Ling, but there was no doubt that the grasshopper thought there was a great deal of good in it, for, just as Ting-A-Ling made a rush at him, he let fly with one of his hind legs, and kicked our little friend so high into the air that he thought he was never coming down again. He landed, however, harmlessly on the grass on the other side of a fence. Nothing discouraged, he jumped up with his bridle still in his hand and looked around for the grasshopper. There he was, with his eyes still rolled back and his leg ready for another kick, should Ting-A-Ling approach him again. But the little fellow had had enough of those strong legs, and so he slipped along the fence, and getting through it, stole around in front of the grasshopper, and while he was still looking backward with all his eyes, Ting-A-Ling stepped quietly up before him and slipped the bridle over his head. It was of no use for the grasshopper to struggle and pull back, for Ting-A-Ling was astraddle of him in a moment, kicking him with his heels and shouting, "Hi, hi!" Away sprang the grasshopper like a bird, and he sped on, faster than he had ever gone before in his life, and Ting-A-Ling waved his little sword over his head and shouted, "Hi, hi!" So on they went for a long time, and in the afternoon the grasshopper began to get very tired, and did not make anything like such long jumps as he had done at first. They were going down a grassy hill, and had just reached the bottom, when Ting-A-Ling heard someone calling him. Looking around him in astonishment, he saw that it was a little fairy of his acquaintance, younger than himself, named Parsley, who was sitting in the shade of a wide-spreading dandelion. "Hello, Parsley!" cried Ting-A-Ling, reining up. "What are you doing here?" "Why, you see, Ting-A-Ling," said the other, "I came out to look for the princess." "You?" cried Ting-A-Ling. "A little fellow like you?" "Yes, I," said Parsley, "and Sourgrass and I rode the same butterfly, but by the time we had come this far we got too heavy, and Sourgrass made me get off." "And what are you going to do now?" said Ting-A-Ling. "Oh, I'm all right," replied Parsley. "I shall have a butterfly of my own soon." "How's that?" asked Ting-A-Ling, quite curious to know. "Come here," said Parsley, and so Ting-A-Ling got off his grasshopper and led it up close to his friend. "See what I've found," said Parsley, showing a cocoon that lay beside him. "I'm going to wait till this butterfly's hatched, and I shall have him the minute he comes out." The idea of waiting for the butterfly to be hatched seemed so funny to Ting-A-Ling that he burst out laughing, and Parsley laughed too, and so did the grasshopper, for he took this opportunity to slip his head out of the bridle, and away he went. Ting-A-Ling turned and gazed in amazement at the grasshopper skipping up the hill, and Parsley, when he had done laughing, advised him to hunt around for another cocoon and follow his example. Ting-A-Ling did not reply to this advice, but throwing his bridle to Parsley, said, "There, you would better take that. You may want it when your butterfly's hatched. I shall push on." "What, walk?" cried Parsley. "Yes, walk," said Ting-A-Ling. "Goodbye." So Ting-A-Ling travelled on by himself for the rest of the day, and it was nearly evening when he came to a wide brook with beautiful green banks and overhanging trees. Here he sat down to rest himself, and while he was wondering if it would be a good thing for him to try to get across, he amused himself by watching the sports and antics of various insects and fishes that were enjoying themselves that fine summer evening. Plenty of butterflies and dragonflies were there, but Ting-A-Ling knew that he would never catch one of them, for they were nearly all the time over the surface of the water, and many a big fish was watching them from below, hoping that in their giddy flights some of them would come near enough to be snapped down for supper. There were spiders who shot over the surface of the brook as if they had been skating, and all sorts of beautiful bugs and flies were there, green, yellow, emerald, gold, and black. At a short distance, Ting-A-Ling saw a crowd of little minnows who had caught a young tadpole, and having tied a bluebell to his tail, were now chasing the affrighted creature about. But after a while the tadpole's mother came out, and then the minnows caught it. While watching all these lively creatures, Ting-A-Ling fell asleep, and when he awoke it was dark night. He jumped up and looked about him. The butterflies and dragonflies had all gone to bed, and now the great night bugs and buzzing beetles were out, the katydids were chirping in the trees, and the frogs were croaking among the long reeds. Not far off, on the same side of the brook, Ting-A-Ling saw the light of a fire, and so he walked over to see what it meant. On his way he came across some wild honeysuckles, and pulling one of the blossoms, he sucked out the sweet juice for his supper as he walked along. When he reached the fire, he saw sitting around it 5 men with turbans and great black beards. Ting-A-Ling instantly perceived that they were magicians, and putting the honeysuckle to his lips, he blew a little tune upon it, which the magicians hearing, they said to one another, "There is a fairy near us." Then Ting-A-Ling came into the midst of them, and climbing up on a pile of cloaks and shawls, conversed with them, and he soon heard that they knew, by means of their magical arts, that the princess had been stolen the night before by the slaves of a wicked dwarf, and that she was now locked up in his castle, which was on top of a high mountain, not far from where they then were. "I shall go there right off," said Ting-A-Ling. "And what will you do when you get there?" said the youngest magician, whose name was Zamkar. "This dwarf is a terrible little fellow, and the same one who twisted poor Naralina's head, which circumstance, of course, you remember. He has numbers of fierce slaves and a great castle. You are a good little fellow, but I don't think you could do much for the princess if you did go to her." Ting-A-Ling reflected a moment, and then said that he would go to his friend, the giant Turelira. But Zamkar told him that that tremendous individual had gone to the uttermost limits of China to launch a ship. It was such a big one and so heavy that it had sunk down into the earth as tight as if it had grown there, and all the men and horses in the country could not move it. So there was nothing to do but to send for Turelira. When Ting-A-Ling heard this, he was disheartened, and hung his little head. "The best thing to do," remarked Alcahazar, the oldest of the magicians, "would be to inform the king and his army of the place where the princess is confined, and let them go and take her out." "Oh, no!" cried Ting-A-Ling, who, if his body was no larger than a very small pea-pod, had a soul as big as a watermelon. "If the king knows it, up he will come with all his drums and horns, and the dwarf will hear him a mile off and either kill the princess or hide her away. If we were all to go to the castle, I should think we could do something ourselves." This was the longest speech that Ting-A-Ling had ever made, and when he was through, the youngest magician said to the others that he thought it was growing cooler, and the others agreed that it was. After some conversation among themselves in an exceedingly foreign tongue, these kind magicians agreed to go up to the castle and see what they could do. So Zamkar put Ting-A-Ling in the folds of his turban, and the whole party started off for the dwarf's castle. They looked like a company of traveling merchants, each one having a package on his back and a great staff in his hand. When they reached the outer gate of the castle, Al-Kahasar, the oldest, knocked at it with his stick, and it was opened at once by a shiny black slave, who, coming out, shut it behind him and inquired what the travelers wanted. "Is your master within?" asked Al-Kahasar. "I don't know," said the slave. "Can't you find out?" asked the magician. "Well, good merchant, perhaps I might, but I don't particularly want to know," said the slave, as he leaned back against the gate, leisurely striking with his long sword at the night bugs and beetles that were buzzing about. "My friend," said Al-Kahasar, "don't you think that it is rather a careless way of using a sword? You might cut somebody." "That's true," said the slave. "I didn't think of it before." But he kept on striking away all the same. "Then stop it," said Al-Kahasar, the oldest magician, striking the sword from his hand with one blow of his staff. Upon this, up stepped Ormanduz, the next oldest, and whacked the slave over his head. And then Mahala, the next oldest, struck him over the shoulders, and Akbek, the next oldest, cracked him on the shins, and Zamkar, the youngest, punched him in the stomach. And the slave sat down and begged the noble merchants to please stop. So they stopped, and he humbly informed them that his master was in. "We would see him," said Al-Kahasar. "But, sirs," said the slave, "he is having a grand feast." "Well," said the magician, "we're invited." "Oh, noble merchants," cried the slave, "why did you not tell me that before?" And he opened wide the gate and let them in. After they had passed the outer gate, which was of wood, they went through another of iron, and another of brass, and another of copper, and then walked through the courtyard, filled with armed slaves, and up the great castle steps, at the top of which stood the butler, dressed in gorgeous array. "Whom have you here, base slave?" cried the gorgeous butler. "5 noble merchants invited to my lord's feast," said the slave, bowing to the ground. "But they cannot enter the banqueting hall in such garbs," said the butler. "They cannot be noble merchants if they come not nobly dressed to my lord's feast." "Oh, sir," said Al-Kahasar, "may your delicate and far-reaching understanding be written in books and taught to youth in foreign lands, and may your profound judgment ever overawe your country. But allow us now to tell you that we have gorgeous dresses in these our packs. Would we soil them with the dust of travel ere we entered the halls of my lord the dwarf?" The butler bowed low at this address, and caused the 5 magicians to be conducted to 5 magnificent chambers, where were slaves, and lights, and baths, and soap, and towels, and wash-rags, and toothbrushes. And each magician took a gorgeous dress from his pack and put it on, and then they were all conducted, with Ting-A-Ling still in Zamkar's turban, to the grand hall, where the feast was being held. Here they found the dwarf and his guests, numbering 100, having a truly jolly time. The dwarf, who was dressed in white, to make him look larger, was seated on a high red velvet cushion at the end of the hall, and the company sat cross-legged on rugs in a great circle before him. He was drinking out of a huge bottle nearly as big as himself, and eating little birds, and judging by the bones that were left, he must have eaten nearly a whole flock of them. When he saw the 5 magicians entering, he stopped eating and opened his eyes in amazement, and then shouted to his servants to tell him who these people were, who came without permission to his feast. but as no one knew, nobody answered. The guests, seeing the stately demeanor and magnificent dresses of the visitors, thought that they were at least 5 great monarchs. "My lord the dwarf," said Alcahazar, advancing toward him, "I am the king of a far country, and passing your castle, and hearing of your feast, I have made bold to come and offer you some of the sweet-tasting birds of my kingdom." So saying, he lifted up his richly embroidered cloak and took from under it a great silver dish containing about 200 dozen hot, smoking, delicately cooked, fat little birds. Under the dish were fastened lamps of perfumed oil, all lighted, and keeping the savory food nice and hot. Making a low bow, the magician placed the dish before the dwarf, who tasted one of the birds and immediately clapped his hands with joy. "Great king!" he cried. "Welcome to my feast! Slaves, quick, make room for the great king!" As there was no vacant place, the slaves took hold of one of the guests and gave him what the boys would call a hist right through the window, and Alcahazar took his place. Then stepped forward Ormanduz, and he said, "My lord the dwarf, I am also the king of a far country, and I have made bold to offer you some of the wine of my kingdom." So saying, he lifted his gold-lined cloak and took from beneath it a crystal decanter covered with gold and ruby ornaments, with 101 beautifully carved silver goblets hanging from its neck, and which contained about 11 gallons of the most delicious wine. He placed it before the dwarf, who, having tasted the wine, gave a great cheer and shouted to his slaves to make room for this mighty king. So the slaves took another guest by the neck and heels and sent him slam-bang through the window, and Ormanduz took his place. Then stepped forward Mahala and said, "My lord, the dwarf, I am also the king of a far country, and I bring you a sample of the venison of my kingdom." So saying, he raised his velvet cloak, trimmed with diamonds, and took from under it a whole deer already cooked, and stuffed with oysters, anchovies, buttered toast, olives, tamarind seeds, sweet marjoram, sage, and many other herbs and spices, and all piping hot and smelling deliciously. This he put down before the dwarf, who, when he had tasted it, waved his goblet over his head and cried out to the slaves to make room for this mighty king. So the slaves seized another guest, and out of the window like a shot he went, and Mahala took his place. Then Akbek stepped up and said, "My lord the dwarf, I am also the king of a far country, and I bring you some of the confections of my dominions." So saying, he took from under his cloak of gold cloth a great basket of silver filigree work, in which were cream chocolates and burnt almonds and sponge cake and ladies' fingers and mixtures and ginger nuts and horehound candy and gumdrops and fruit cake and cream candy and mint stick and pound cake and rock candy and butter taffy and many other confections, amounting in all to about 220 pounds. He placed the basket before the dwarf, who tasted some of these good things and found them so delicious that he lay on his back and kicked up his heels in delight, shouting to his slaves to make room for this great king. As the next guest was a big fat man, too heavy to throw far, he was seized by 4 slaves, who walked him Spanish right out of the door, and Akbek took his place. Then Zamkar stepped forward and said, "My lord the dwarf, I also am king of a far country, and I bring you some of the fruit of my dominions." And so saying, he took from beneath his gold and purple cloak a great basket filled with currants as big as grapes, and grapes as big as plums, and plums as big as peaches, and peaches as big as cantaloupes, and cantaloupes as big as watermelons, and watermelons as big as barrels. There were about 19 bushels of them altogether, and he put them before the dwarf, who, having tasted some of them, clapped his hands and shouted to his slaves to make room for this mighty king. But as the next guest had very sensibly got up and gone out, Zamkar took his seat without any delay. Then Ting-A-Ling, who was very much excited by all these wonderful performances, slipped down out of Zamkar's turban, and running up towards the dwarf, cried, "My lord the dwarf, I also am the king of a far country, and I bring you—" And he lifted up his little cloak, but as there was nothing there, he said no more, but clambered up into Zamkar's turban again. As nobody noticed or heard him, so great was the bustle and noise of the festivity, his speech made no difference one way or the other. After everybody had eaten and drunk until they could eat and drink no more, the dwarf jumped up and called to the chief butler to know how many beds were prepared for the guests, to which the butler answered that there were 30 beds prepared. "Then," said the dwarf, "give these 5 noble kings each one of the best rooms, with a down bed, and silk and comfortable, and give the other beds to the 25 biggest guests. As to the rest, turn them out." So the dwarf went to bed, and each of the magicians had a splendid room, and 25 of the biggest guests had beds, and the rest were all turned out. As it was pouring down rain, and freezing, and cold, and wet, and slippery, for the weather was very unsettled on this mountain, and all these guests, who now found themselves outside of the castle gates, lived many miles away, and as none of them had any hats or knew the way home, they were very miserable indeed. Alcahazar did not go to bed, but sat in his room and reflected. He saw that the dwarf had given this feast on account of his joy at having captured the princess, and thus caused grief to the king and prince and all the people. But it was also evident that he was very sly, and had not mentioned the matter to any of the company. The other magicians did not go to bed either, but sat in their rooms and thought the same thing, and Ting-A-Ling in Zamkar's turban was of exactly the same opinion. So in about an hour, when all was still, the magicians got up and went softly over the castle. One went down into the lower rooms, and there were all the slaves fast asleep, and another into one wing of the castle, and there were half the guests fast asleep, and another into the other wing, and there were the rest of the guests fast asleep, and Alcahazar went into the dwarf's room in the center of the castle, and there he was fast asleep, with one of his fists shut tight. The magician touched his fist with his magic staff, and it immediately opened, and there was a key. So Alcahazar took the key and shut up the dwarf's hand again. Zamkar went up to the floor near the top of the house and entered a large room, which was empty, but the walls were hung with curtains made of snake skins, beautifully woven together. Ting-A-Ling slipped down to the floor, and peeping behind these curtains, saw the hinge of a door, and without saying a word, he got behind the curtain, and sure enough, there was a door, and there was a keyhole, and in a minute there was Ting-A-Ling right through it, and there was the princess in a chair in the middle of a great room, crying as if her heart would break. By the light of the moon, which had now broken through the clouds, Ting-A-Ling saw that she was tied fast to the chair. So he climbed up on her shoulder and called her by name. And when the princess heard him and knew him, she took him into her lovely hands and kissed him and cried over him and laughed over him so much that her joy had like to have been the death of him. When she got over her excitement, she told him how she had been stolen away, how she had heard her favorite cat squeak in the middle of the night, and how she had got up quickly to go to it, supposing it had been squeezed in some door, and how the wicked dwarf, who had been imitating the cat, was just outside the door with his slaves, and how they had seized her and bound her and carried her off to this castle without waking up any of the king's household. Then Ting-A-Ling told her that his 5 friends were there, and that they were going to see what they could do, and the princess was very glad to hear that, you may be sure. Then Ting-A-Ling slipped down to the floor and through the keyhole, and as he entered the room where he had left Zamkar, in came Alcahazar with the key, and the other magicians with news that everybody was asleep. When Ting-A-Ling had told about the princess, Alcahazar pushed aside the curtains, unlocked the door with the key, and they all entered the next room. There, sure enough, was the Princess Ophelia, but right in front of her, on the floor, squatted the dwarf, who had missed his key and had slipped up by a back way. The magician started back on seeing him. The princess was crying bitterly, and Ting-A-Ling ran past the dwarf, who was laughing too horribly to notice him, and climbing upon the princess's shoulder, sat there among her curls and did his best to comfort her. "Anyway," said he, "I shall not leave you again." And he drew his little sword and felt as big as a house. The magicians now advanced toward the dwarf, but he, it seems, was a bit of a magician himself, for he waved a little wand, and instantly a strong partition of iron wire rose up out of the floor, and reaching from one wall to the other, separated him completely from the 5 men. The magicians no sooner saw this than they cried out, "Oh ho, Mr. Dwarf, is that your game?" "Yes," said the little wretch, chuckling. "Can you play at it?" "A little," said they, and each one pulled from under his cloak a long file, and filing the partition from the wall on each side, which only needed a few strokes from their sharp files, they pulled it entirely down. But before the magicians could reach him, the dwarf again waved his wand, and a great chasm opened in the floor before them, which was too wide to jump over, and so deep that the bottom could not be seen. "Oh ho!" cried the magicians. "Another game, eh?" "Yes, indeed," cried the dwarf. "Just let me see you play at that." Each of the magicians then took from under his magic cloak a long board, and putting them over the chasm, they began to walk across them. But the dwarf jumped up and waved his wand, and water commenced to fall on the boards, where it immediately froze, and they were so slippery that the magicians could hardly keep their feet, and could not make one step forward. Even standing still, they came very near falling off into the chasm below. "I suppose you can play at that," said the dwarf. And the magicians replied, "Oh, yes," and each one took from under his cloak a pan of ashes, and sprinkled the boards and walked right over. But before they reached the other edge, the dwarf pushed the chair, which was on rollers, up against the wall behind him, which opened, and instantly the princess, Ting-A-Ling, and the dwarf disappeared, and the wall closed up. Without saying a word, the magicians each drew from beneath his cloak a pickaxe, and they cut a hole in the wall in a few minutes. There was a large room on the other side, but it was entirely empty, so they sat down and got out their magical calculators, and soon discovered that the princess was in the lowest part of the castle. But the magical calculators being a little out of order, they could not show exactly her place of confinement. Then the 5 hurried downstairs, where they found the slaves still asleep, but one poor little boy, whose business it was to get up early every morning and split kindling wood, having had none of the feast, was not very sleepy, and woke up when he heard footsteps near him. The magicians asked him if he could show them the lowest part of the castle. "All right," said he, "this way," and he led them to where there was a great black hole with a windlass over it. "Get in the bucket," said he, "and I will lower you down." "Bucket?" cried Alcahazar. "Is that a well?" "To be sure it is," said the boy, who had nothing on but the baby clothes he had worn ever since he was born, and which, as he was now about 10 years old, had split a good deal in the back and arms, but in length they were very suitable. "But there can be no one down there," said the magician. "I see deep water." "Of course there is nobody there," replied the boy. "Were you told to go down there to meet anybody? Because if you were, you had better take some tubs down with you to sit in. But all I know about it is that it's the lowest part of this old hole of a castle." "Boy," said Alcahazar, "there is a young lady shut up down here somewhere. Do you know where she is?" "How old is she?" asked the boy. "About 17, said the magician. "Oh, then, if she is no older than that, I should think she'd be in the preserve closet if she knew where it was." And the boy pointed to a great door, barred and locked, where the dwarf, who had a very sweet tooth, kept all his preserves locked up tight and fast. Zamkar stooped and looked through the keyhole of this door, and there, sure enough, was the princess. So the boy proved to be smarter than all the magicians. Each of our 5 friends now took from under his cloak a crowbar, and in a minute they had forced open the great door. But they had scarcely entered when the dwarf, springing on the arm of the chair to which the princess was still tied, drew his sword and clapped it to her throat, crying out that if the magicians came one step nearer, he would slice her head off. "Oh ho!" cried they, "is that your game?"
"Yes, indeed,"
said the chuckling dwarf. "Can you play at it?" The magicians did not appear to think that they could, but Ting-A-Ling, who was still on the princess's shoulder, though unseen by the dwarf, suddenly shouted, "I can play!" And in an instant he had driven his little sword into the dwarf's eye, who immediately sprang from the chair with a howl of anguish. While he was yelling and skipping about, with his hands to his eyes, the poor boy, who hated him worse than pills, clapped a great jar of preserves over him and sat down on the bottom of the jar. The magicians then untied the princess, and as she looked weak and faint, Zamkar, the youngest, took from under his cloak a little table, set with everything hot and nice for supper. And when the princess had eaten something and taken a cup of tea, she felt a great deal better. Alcahazar lifted up the jar from the dwarf, and there was the little rascal, so covered up with sticky jam that he could not speak and could hardly move. So taking an oilcloth bag from under his cloak, Alcahazar dropped the dwarf into it and tied it up and hung it to his girdle. The two youngest magicians made a sort of chair out of a shawl, and they carried the princess on it between them very comfortably, and as Ting-A-Ling still remained on her shoulder, she began to feel that things were beginning to look brighter. They then asked the poor boy what he would like best as a reward for what he had done. And he said that if they would shut him up in that room and lock the door tight and lose the key, he would be happy all the days of his life. So they left the boy, who knew what was good and was already sucking away at a jar of preserved green gages, in the room, and they shut the door and locked it tight and lost the key. And he lived there for 91 years, eating preserves, and when they were all gone, he died. All that time he never had any clothes but his baby clothes, and they got pretty sticky before his death. Then our party left the castle, and as they passed the slaves still fast asleep, the three oldest magicians took from under their cloaks watering pots filled with water that makes men sleep, and they watered the slaves with it until they were wet enough to sleep a week. When they went through the gates of copper, brass, iron, and wood, they left them all open behind them. They had not gone far before they saw 75 men, all sitting in a row at the side of the road and looking woefully indeed. They had been wet to the skin and were now frozen stiff, not one of them being able to move anything but his eyelids, and they were all crying as if their hearts would break. So the magician stopped, and the three oldest each took from under his cloak a pair of bellows, and they blew hot air on the poor creatures until they were all thawed. Then Alcahazar told them to go up to the castle and take it for their own, and live there all the rest of their lives. He informed them that the dwarf was his prisoner, and that the slaves would sleep for a week. When the 75 guests, for those who had been taken from the feast had joined their comrades, heard this, they all started up and ran like deer for the castle, and when they reached it, they woke up their comrades and took possession and lived there all their lives. The man who had been first thrown through the window and who had broken the way through the glass for the others was elected their chief because he had suffered the most, and accepting the trouble of doing their own work for a week until the slaves awoke, these people were very happy ever afterwards. It was just daylight when our party left the dwarf's castle, and by the next evening they had reached the palace. The army had not got back, and there was no one there but the ladies of the princess. When these saw their dear mistress, there was never before such a kissing and hugging and crying and laughing. Ting-A-Ling came in for a good share of praise and caressing, and if he had not slipped away to tell his tale to the fairy queen, there was no knowing what would have become of him. The magicians sat down outside of the princess's apartments to guard her until the army should return, and the ladies would have kissed and hugged them in their gratitude and joy if they had not been such dignified and grave personages. Now the king, the prince, and the great army had gone miles and miles away in the opposite direction to the dwarf's castle, and the princess and her ladies could not think how to let them know what had happened. As for ringing the great bell, they knew that that would be useless, for they would never hear it at the distance they were, and so they wished that they had some fireworks to set off. Therefore Zamkar, the youngest magician, offered to go up to the top of the palace and set off some. So when he got up to the roof, he lifted up his cloak and took out some fireworks and set them off. And the light shone for miles and miles, and the king and all his army saw it. The king had just begun to feel tired and to think that he would pitch his tent and rest for the night by the side of a pleasant stream they had reached, when he saw the light from the palace and instantly knew that there had been tidings of the princess. Kings are smart, you know. So when his slaves came to ask him where they should pitch his tent, he shouted, "Pitch it in the river! Tention, army! Right about face for home! March!" And away the whole army marched for home, the band playing the lively air of "Cream cakes for supper, hi-oh, hi-oh, oh, cream cakes for supper, hi-oh, hi-oh," so as to keep up the spirits of the tired men. When they approached the palace, which was all lighted up, there was the princess standing at the great door in her Sunday clothes and looking as lovely as a full-blown rose. The king jumped from his high-mettled racer and went up the steps 2 at a time, but the prince, springing from his fiery steed, bounded up 3 steps at once and got there first. When he and the king had got through hugging and kissing the princess, her Sunday clothes looked as if they had been worn for a week. "Now then for supper," said the king, "and I hope it's ready." But the princess said never a word, for she had forgotten all about supper, and all the ladies hung their heads and were afraid to speak. But when they reached the great hall, they found that the magicians had been at work and had cooked a grand supper. There it was, on ever so many long tables, all smoking hot and smelling delightfully. So they all sat down, for there was room enough for every man, and nobody said a word until he was as tight as a drum. When they had all had enough, and were just about to begin to talk, there were heard strains of the most delightful soft music, and directly in at a window came the Queen of the Fairies, attended by her court, all mounted on beautiful golden moths and dragonflies. When they reached the velvet table in front of the throne where the king had been eating, with his plate on his lap, they arranged themselves in a circle on the table, and the queen spoke out in a clear little voice that could have been heard almost anywhere, and announced to the king that the little Ting-A-Ling, who now wore her royal scarf, was the preserver of his daughter. "Oh ho," said the king, "and what can I do for such a mite as you, my fine little fellow?" Then Ting-A-Ling, who wanted nothing for himself and only thought of the good of his people, made a low bow to the king and shouted at the top of his voice, "Your royal gardeners are going to make asparagus beds all over our fairy pleasure grounds. If you can prevent that, I have nothing more to ask." "Blow, Horner, blow," cried the king, "and hear all men. If any man, woman, or child, from this time henceforward forever, shall dare to set foot in the garden now occupied by the fairies, he shall be put to death, he and all his family and his relations, as far as they can be traced. Take notice of that, every one of you." Ting-A-Ling then bowed his thanks, and all the people made up their minds to take very particular notice of what the king had said. Then the magicians were ordered to come forward and name their reward, but they bowed their heads and simply besought the king that he would grant them 7 rye straws, the peeling from a red apple, and the heel from one of his old slippers. What in the name of common sense they wanted with these, no one but themselves knew, but magicians are such strange creatures. When these valuable gifts had been bestowed upon them, the 5 good magicians departed, leaving the dwarf for the king to do what he pleased with. This little wretch was shut up in an iron cage, and every day was obliged to eat 3 codfish, a bushel of Irish potatoes, and 11 pounds of bran crackers, and to drink a gallon of cambric tea, all of which things he despised from the bottom of his miserable little heart. "Now," cried the king, "all is settled, and let everybody go to bed. There is room enough in the palace for all to sleep tonight. Form in line, and to bed. March!" So they all formed in line and began to march to bed to the music of the band and the fairies, their little horns blowing, and with Ting-A-Ling at the post of honor by the queen, took up their line of march out of the window to the garden, which was to be henceforward forever their own. Just as they were all filing out, in flew little Parsley on the back of his butterfly, which had been hatched at last. "Hello!" cried he. "Is it all over?" "Pretty nearly," said Ting-A-Ling. "It's just letting out. How came you to be so late?" "Easy enough," said poor little Parsley. "Of all the mean things that ever was the pokiest long time in unwrapping its wings, this butterfly's the meanest." End of Ting-A-Ling and the 5 Magicians. Which is Best? From The Wonder Clock by Howard Pyle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. 4 o'clock. Bare-necked Gretchen combs her hair at the looking-glass. This is grease, and these are beads she takes to early mass. Her water pitcher, blue and white, has got a broken nose, and both the stockings that she wears are ravelled at the toes. Which is best? There was a rich man who lived on a hill, and a poor man who lived down in the valley, and they were brothers. The one was older and the other younger. The one lived in a grand house, and the other in a little rickety, tumble-down hut. And the one was covetous and greedy, and the other was kind and merciful. All the same, it was a merry life that the poor brother led of it, for each morning when he took a drink he said, "Thank heaven for clear water." And when the day was bright he said, "Thank heaven for the warm sun that shines on us all." And when it was wet, it was, "Thank heaven for the gentle rain that makes the green grass grow." One day the poor brother was riding in the forest, and there he met the rich brother, and they jogged along the way together. The one rode upon a poor old spavined white horse, and the other rode upon a fine prancing steed. By and by they met an old woman, and it was all that she could do to hobble along the way she was going. "Dear, good, kind gentleman," said she, "do help a poor old body with a penny or two, for it is nothing I have in the world, and life sits heavy on old shoulders." The rich brother was for passing along as though he had never heard a word of what she said, but the poor brother had a soft heart, and reined in his horse. "It is only 3 farthings that I have in the world," said he, "but such as they are, you are welcome to them." And he emptied his purse into her hand. "You shall not have the worst of the bargain," said the old woman. "Here is something that is worth the having." And she gave him a little black stone about as big as a bean. Then off she went with what he had given her. "See now," said the rich brother, "that is why you are so poor, as hardly to be able to make both ends meet in the world." "That may be so, or may not be so," said the poor brother. "All the same, mercy is better than greed." How the elder did laugh at this, to be sure. "Why, look," says he, "here I am riding upon a grand horse with my pockets full of gold and silver money, and there you are, astride of a beast that can hardly hobble along the road, and with never a copper bit in your pocket to jingle against another." Yes, that was all true enough. Nevertheless, the younger brother stuck to it that mercy was better than greed, until at last the other flew into a mighty huff. "Very well," says he, "I will wager my horse against yours that I am right, and we will leave it to the first body we meet to settle the point." Well, that suited the poor brother, and he was agreed to do as the other said. So by and by they met a grand lord riding along the road with 6 servants behind him, and would he tell whether mercy or greed were the best for a body in this world? The rich lord laughed and laughed. "Why," said he, "greed is the best, for if it were otherwise, and I had only what belonged to me, I should never be jogging along through the world with 6 servants behind me." So off he rode, and the poor brother had to give up his horse to the other, who had no more use for it than I have for 5 more fingers. "All the same," says the poor brother, "mercy is better than greed." Goodness, what a rage the rich brother fell into, to be sure. "There is no teaching a simpleton," said he. "Nevertheless, I will wager all the money in my purse against your left eye that greed is better than mercy, and we will leave it to the next body we meet, since you are not content with the other." That suited the younger brother well enough, and on they jogged until they met a rich merchant driving a donkey loaded with things to sell. And would he judge between them whether mercy or greed were the best for a body? "Poof," says the merchant, "what a question to ask! All the world knows that greed is the best. If it were not for taking the cool end of the bargain myself, and leaving the hot end for my neighbor to hold, it is little or nothing that I should have in the world to call my own." And off he went whither he was going. "There," says the rich brother, "now perhaps you will be satisfied." And he put out the poor man's left eye. But no, the other still held that mercy was better than greed, and so they made another wager of all the rich man had in the world against the poor man's right eye. This time it was a poor plowman whom they met, and would he tell whether mercy or greed were the best? "But," said he, "any simpleton can tell that greed is the best, for all the world rides upon the poor man's shoulders, and he is able to bear the burden least of all." Then the rich man put out the poor man's right eye. "For," says he, "a body deserves to be blind who cannot see the truth when it is as plain as a pikestaff." But still the poor man stuck to it that mercy was the best, so the rich man rode away and left him in his blindness. As all was darkness to his eyes, he sat down beside the road at the first place he could find, and that was underneath the gallows where 3 wicked robbers had been hung. While he sat there, 2 ravens came flying and lit on the gallows above him. They began talking to one another, and the younger brother heard what they said, for he could understand the speech of the birds of the air and of the beasts of the field, just as little children can, because he was innocent. And the first raven said to the second raven, "Yonder below sits a fellow in blindness, because he held that mercy was better than greed." And the second raven said to the first, "Yes, that is so, but he might have his sight again if he only knew enough to spread his handkerchief upon the grass and bathe his eyes in the dew which falls upon it from the gallows above." And the first raven said to the second, "That is as true that 1 and 1 make 2, but there is more to tell yet, for in his pocket he carries a little black stone with which he may open every door that he touches. Back of the oak tree yonder is a little door. If he would but enter thereat, he would find something below well worth the having." That was what the two ravens said, and then they flapped their wings and flew away. As for the younger brother, you can guess how his heart danced at what he had heard. He spread his handkerchief on the grass, and by, when night came, the dew fell upon it until it was as wet as clothes on the line. He wiped his eyes with it, and when the dew touched the lids, they were cured, and he could see as well and better than ever. By and by the day broke, and he lost no time in finding the door back of the oak tree. He touched the lock with the little black stone, and the door opened as smoothly as though the hinges were greased. There he found a flight of steps that led down into a pit as dark as a beer vault. Down the steps he went, and on, until at last he came to a great room, the like of which his eyes had never seen before. In the center of the room was a statue as black as ink. In one hand it held a crystal globe, which shone with a clear white light, so that it dazzled one's eyes to look upon it. In the other hand it held a great diamond as big as a hen's egg. Upon the breast of the statue were written these words in letters of gold: "What thou deservest, that thou shalt have." On 3 sides of the room sat 3 statues, and at the feet of each statue stood a heavy chest. The first statue was of gold, and over its head were written these words: "Who chooses here takes the best that the earth has to give." The second statue was of silver, and over its head was written these words: "Who chooses here takes what the rich man loves." The third statue was of dull lead, and over its head was written: "Who chooses here takes what he should have." The man touched the chest at the feet of the golden statue with the little black stone, and click-clack, up flew the lid, and the chest was full of all kinds of precious stones. "Poof!" said the younger brother, "and if this is the best that the world has to give, it is poor enough," and he shut down the lid again. He touched the chest at the feet of the silver statue with his little black stone, and it was full of gold and silver money. "Push!" says he, "and if this is what the rich man loves, why, so do not I," and he shut down the lid again. Last of all, he touched the chest at the feet of the leaden statue. It was a book, and the letters on it said that whoever read within would know all that was worth the knowing. Beside the book was a pair of spectacles, and whoever set them astride his nose might see the truth without having to rub the glasses with his pocket handkerchief. But the best of all in the chest was an apple, and whoever ate of it would be cured of sorrow and sickness. "Hi!" said the younger brother, "but these are worth the having, for sure and certain." And he put the spectacles upon his nose and the apple and the book in his pocket. Then off he went, and the spectacles showed him the way, although it was as crooked as sin and as black as night. So by and by he came out into the blessed sunlight again, and at the same place where he had gone in. Off he went to his own home as fast as his legs could carry him, and you can guess how the rich brother stared when he saw the poor brother back in that town again with his eyesight as good as ever. As for the poor brother, he just turned his hand to being a doctor, and there has never been one like him since that day, for not only could he cure all sickness with his apple, but he could cure all sorrow as well. Money and fame poured in on him, and whenever trouble lit on his shoulders, he just put on his spectacles and looked into the business, and then opened the book of wisdom and found how to cure it. So his life was as happy as the day was long, and a body can ask for no more than that in this world here below. One day the rich brother came and knocked at the other's door. "Well, brother," says he, I am glad to see you are getting along so well in the world. Let us let bygones be bygones and live together as we should, for I am very sorry for what I did to you." Well, that suited the younger brother well enough. He bore no malice against the other, for all that had been done had turned out for the best. All the same, he was more sure than ever now that mercy was better than greed. The elder brother twisted up his face at this, as though the words were sour. All the same, he did not argue the question, for what he had come for was to find why the world had grown so easy with the other all of a sudden. So in he came, and they lit their pipes and sat down by the stove together. He was a clean blade, was the elder brother, and it was not long before he had screwed the whole story out of the other. "Dear, dear, dear," said he, "I only wish I could find a black pebble like that one of yours." "It would do you no good if you had it," said the younger brother, "for I have brought away all that is worth the having. All the same, if you want my black pebble now, you are welcome to it." Did the elder brother want it? Why, of course he wanted it, and he could not find words enough to thank the younger. Off he went, hot foot, to find the door back of the oak tree. "For," said he to himself, "I will bring something back better worth the having than a musty book, an old pair of spectacles, and a red apple." He touched the door with the black stone, and it opened for him just as it had for the younger brother. Down the steps he went, and on and on and on, until by and by he came to the room where the statues were. There was the black statue holding out the crystal ball and the diamond as big as a hen's egg, and there sat the golden statue and the silver statue and the leaden statue, just as they had sat when the younger brother had been there, only there was nothing in the chest at the feet of the leaden statue. The rich brother touched the lock of the chest in front of the silver statue. Up flew the lid, and there lay all the gold and silver money. "Yes," says he, "that is what the rich man loves, sure enough. Nevertheless, there may be something else that is better worth the having." So he let the money lay where it was. He touched the chest in front of the golden statue. Up flew the lid, and he had to blink and wink his eyes because the precious stones dazzled him so. "Yes," says he, "this is the best the world has to give, and there is no gainsaying that. All the same, there may be something better worth the having than these." So he looked all about the room until he saw the golden letters on the breast of the black statue that stood in the middle. First he read the words, "What thou deservest, that thou shalt have." And then he saw the great diamond that the statue held in its left hand. "Why," said he, "it is as plain as daylight that I deserve this precious stone for not being so simple as my brother and taking what I could find without looking for anything better." So up he stepped and took the diamond out of the statue's hand. Crash! And all was darkness, darker than the darkest midnight, for as quick as a wink, the black statue let the crystal globe of light fall from its right hand upon the stone floor, where it broke into 10,000 pieces. And now the rich brother might wander up and wander down, but wander as he chose, he could never find his way out of that place again, for the darkness shut him in like a blanket. So, after all, mercy and temperance were better in the long run than greed and covetousness, in spite of what the great lord and the rich merchant and the poor ploughman had said. Maybe I have got this story twisted awry in the telling. All the same, Tommy Pafus says that it is a true enough story if you put on your spectacles and look at it from the right side. End of Which is Best from The Wonder Clock by Howard Pyle. Read by Linda Sonrisa Jones.